How do you live when you've seen through life's fundamental illusions? The question haunts every moment of genuine philosophical awakening. How do you find meaning when you've discovered that existence is essentially suffering? The weight of this recognition can crush the unprepared mind. How do you maintain compassion when you've realized that all human striving is ultimately futile? These aren't abstract thought experiments for academic discussion. They are the lived reality of anyone who has pierced what Arthur Schopenhauer called the veil of Maya and glimpsed existence as it truly is. Arthur Schopenhauer faced these questions not as philosophical puzzles, but as urgent demands for wisdom. Born in 1788 into a world convulsing with revolutionary upheaval, he witnessed humanity at its most brutal and desperate. His merchant father's suicide, when Arthur was just 17, shattered any comfortable illusions about life's inherent goodness. His complex, often bitter relationship with his literary mother, Johanna, a woman who chose social success over maternal devotion, revealed the hollowness of conventional human bonds. These weren't merely personal tragedies, but raw material for systematic philosophical investigation. From this crucible of suffering emerged one of philosophy's most revolutionary insights. "The world is my representation," Schopenhauer declared, fundamentally reconceiving reality itself. This wasn't merely an academic position, but the fruit of direct confrontation with human pretension and social delusion. Everything we take to be external reality, the solid world of objects, the seemingly independent existence of other people, even our own bodies, is actually a construction of consciousness filtered through the cognitive apparatus that makes experience possible. This insight became the foundation for his entire philosophical system. What makes Schopenhauer uniquely compelling is how his system moves with inexorable logic from epistemological insight through metaphysical discovery to practical wisdom. Unlike philosophers who offer comforting abstractions, Schopenhauer provides a unified vision that confronts life's darkest realities, whilst genuinely opening paths to peace, compassion, and in rare cases, complete liberation from the cycle of desire and suffering. His philosophy doesn't promise easy answers. It promises true ones. The challenge he presents is profound. Once you understand that the phenomenal world is representation, you must confront what lies behind it. Once you discover that this hidden reality is will, blind, irrational striving, you must learn to live with ultimate truth. Schopenhauer's genius lies not in sugarcoating existence, but in showing how clear vision, however painful, becomes the foundation for genuine wisdom and authentic compassion. This is philosophy for those who refuse comfortable lies, who demand to see existence without the protective filters of convention and wishful thinking. Schopenhauer offers no false consolation, but something far more valuable: a systematic path through the darkness toward whatever light remains possible for conscious beings trapped in the machinery of desire. Part 1. The World as Representation. Young Schopenhauer made a discovery that would shatter the foundations of how we understand knowledge itself. In his doctoral dissertation, On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, he demonstrated that everything we can possibly know exists only in relation to something else. Nothing stands alone. Nothing exists independently. Every object, every event, every thought we encounter is bound by invisible chains to other things through the fundamental forms of space, time, and causality. This wasn't merely an academic exercise. Schopenhauer had uncovered something profound about the nature of experience itself. He realized that our entire world, everything we see, touch, think about, or investigate, is relational rather than absolute. When you observe a tree, you don't encounter the tree as it is in itself. You encounter it as it appears through spatial extension, temporal duration, and causal relationships with soil, sunlight, and your own perceptual apparatus. The principle of sufficient reason operates through four distinct dimensions that create the complete architecture of possible knowledge. First, logical reason governs why propositions follow from premises, the realm of abstract thought, where conclusions emerge necessarily from their grounds. Second, mathematical reason determines why geometric and arithmetic relations hold, why triangles have angles totaling 180 degrees, why numbers combine according to fixed laws. Third, physical reason explains why events follow from causes, the domain of natural science, where every phenomenon emerges from prior conditions. Fourth, moral reason reveals why actions follow from motives, the sphere of human behavior, where decisions spring from underlying drives and intentions. Whether we're dealing with abstract reasoning, spatial relationships, natural phenomena, or human behavior, we never encounter anything that exists independently. We find only things that exist in relation to other things through these fundamental structures. The physicist traces causes and effects. The mathematician explores spatial and numerical relationships. The logician follows chains of reasoning. The psychologist examines motivational connections. But in every case, knowledge consists in grasping how one thing relates to another, according to the principle of sufficient reason. This principle both enables knowledge and, simultaneously, imprisons us within mere appearances. It makes science, mathematics, and rational discourse possible by providing the stable relationships through which understanding operates. Yet it also ensures that we can never penetrate to things as they are in themselves. As Schopenhauer put it, the principle of sufficient reason is the form of all objects, but objects are always mere phenomena, not things in themselves. Here lies the fundamental philosophical problem. Everything we can know is conditioned by the very structures that make knowing possible. Space, time, and causality don't belong to things themselves, but are contributions of the knowing subject, forms through which consciousness must apprehend anything it encounters. The entire phenomenal world, everything we take to be external and independent reality, is actually structured by the mind's own organizing principles. What we call reality is a systematic construction. The pendulum swings in time, occupies space, follows causal laws, and serves human purposes. But these very dimensions through which we know it are not features of the pendulum itself, but conditions of our knowing. We are trapped within a world of appearances, a realm of representations that consciousness creates through its own fundamental forms, never touching what lies behind these constructions. Kant's critical philosophy delivered a devastating blow to naive realism, revealing that space, time, and causality are not features of reality itself, but forms of human intuition and understanding. These are structures the mind brings to experience rather than discovers within it. Yet Kant hesitated at the threshold of his own insight, maintaining a careful distinction between the phenomenal world we experience and the noumenal realm we cannot know. Schopenhauer seized upon this hesitation and pushed Kant's discovery to its radical conclusion. If space, time, and causality are indeed mental forms, then the entire phenomenal world we inhabit is not merely shaped by consciousness, it is actively constructed by it. This construction operates at the most fundamental level of experience. Space creates the appearance of distinct, separate objects, where reality might be fundamentally unified. Consider how spatial intuition, divides the seamless flow of existence into discrete entities. This tree, that mountain, your body, my thoughts, each appears independent, bounded, occupying its own location in an objective container of space. Yet if space itself is a form of representation rather than a feature of things in themselves, then this apparent separation might be the mind's way of organizing what is essentially undifferentiated. Time compounds this illusion by creating linear progression and temporal sequence, where the essential nature of things might be eternal and unchanging. The temporal form makes us experience reality as a stream of successive moments, each replacing the last, creating narratives of development, decay, and transformation. We live perpetually in anticipation and memory, rarely present to what simply is. Meanwhile, causality weaves these spatial separations and temporal sequences into chains of dependency and influence, making us perceive isolated events connected by mechanical relationships rather than recognizing underlying unity. Schopenhauer's crucial insight penetrates deeper than Kant dared venture. Plurality and difference belong only to the phenomenon. The multiplicity we take for granted, the countless separate things populating our world, exists only within the forms of representation. Strip away spatial separation, temporal succession, and causal connection, and the appearance of many distinct entities dissolves. What remains is something that cannot be captured within the subject-object structure that governs all representational knowledge. This recognition transforms our understanding of what we call the external world. The solid, independent, objective reality we navigate daily reveals itself as a collaborative creation between the fundamental nature of existence and the structural forms through which consciousness must apprehend it. The mountains and rivers, the distant stars, and immediate sensations, the entire theater of experience emerges from this intersection of reality in itself with the representational capacities of the experiencing subject. Schopenhauer's declaration that "the world is my representation" captures this insight without falling into solipsism. He does not claim that individual consciousness creates reality from nothing, but rather that the world as experienced is always already shaped by the representational structures through which any possible experience must occur. The phenomenal world is neither purely subjective nor purely objective. It is the necessary result of reality encountering the forms of representation. This creates a profound epistemological crisis. If space, time, and causality are mental forms rather than features of reality itself, then we can never know things as they truly are through ordinary perception and reasoning. Every scientific investigation, every practical judgment, every attempt to understand the nature of existence through empirical observation keeps us trapped within the circle of representations. The more precisely we measure spatial relationships, temporal sequences, and causal connections, the further we move from the reality that underlies these constructions. The implications ripple through every domain of human knowledge. Physics discovers laws governing spatial motion and temporal change, but these laws describe the behavior of phenomena within representational forms, not the nature of reality itself. Schopenhauer discovered in the ancient Hindu concept of Maya the perfect expression of what his own philosophical investigations had revealed about consciousness and reality. When he encountered the Upanishads through Anquetil Duperron's Latin translation, he found himself face to face with an insight that seemed to echo his deepest philosophical intuitions. "The veil of Maya," he wrote, "captures precisely how consciousness systematically deceives itself about the nature of existence, creating a world of apparent multiplicity, separation, and conflict where unity actually prevails." Maya, in the Hindu tradition, represents the cosmic illusion that conceals ultimate reality behind the endless play of appearances. For Schopenhauer, this ancient wisdom perfectly articulated what he had discovered through rigorous philosophical analysis, that the phenomenal world we inhabit is not reality itself, but a systematic distortion of reality created by the very structures that make experience possible. The world as we know it, the world of objects in space and time, connected by causal relations, is Maya, the grand illusion that keeps us from recognizing what truly is. The genius of Schopenhauer's appropriation of Maya lies in his recognition that this illusion operates through the fundamental forms of consciousness itself. Space, time, and causality don't simply organize our experience neutrally, they actively transform whatever reality underlies appearances into something completely different. Through spatial extension, what is unified appears as multiplicity. Through temporal succession, what is eternal appears as change, birth, and death. Through causal connection, what is one appears as countless separate entities acting upon each other. Maya is not merely false belief or mistaken interpretation. It is the necessary function of consciousness itself, the way awareness must structure reality in order to apprehend anything at all. This creates a profound philosophical paradox that Schopenhauer grappled with throughout his career. Consciousness can only know reality by transforming it into something other than what it is. The very act of representation, of making reality present to awareness, inevitably misrepresents it. We cannot step outside consciousness to compare our representations with reality itself, because any such comparison would itself be a representation. Maya is not something we can simply choose to abandon. It is the inescapable condition of conscious existence. The existential consequences of remaining trapped within Maya's illusions are devastating. Living within the veil of appearances perpetuates suffering by making us identify with the separate, temporal, vulnerable individual self rather than recognizing our deeper nature. Maya creates the conditions for conflict, competition, and fear by making us see others as genuinely separate beings whose interests necessarily oppose our own. When I see you as fundamentally other than myself, your gain appears to be my loss, your happiness a threat to mine, your very existence a limitation of my own possibilities. Schopenhauer recognized that all suffering springs from the illusion of separateness, the false belief that we are isolated individuals, struggling against an alien world. This illusion generates the endless cycle of desire and frustration that characterizes human existence. We want what we lack, fear losing what we have, and find ourselves perpetually dissatisfied because we are chasing shadows, pursuing goals that can never ultimately fulfill us, precisely because they are grounded in Maya's fundamental deception about what we are and what reality is. The urgency of piercing Maya's veil becomes clear when we realize that, as long as we remain within the world of representation, we remain trapped in cycles of wanting, temporary satisfaction, boredom, and renewed wanting. Every achievement within the phenomenal world is ultimately hollow because it is achieved by a self that is itself illusory. In pursuit of objects that are themselves mere appearances, the successful businessman, the celebrated artist, the powerful politician, all are playing elaborate games within Maya's theater, mistaking the drama for reality itself. This recognition transforms philosophy from an academic exercise into an existential necessity. Part 2. The Metaphysics of Will. Schopenhauer's greatest philosophical achievement emerged from a startling recognition. Amongst all the phenomena we encounter, there exists precisely one that we know from both sides. Everything else in our experience comes to us only as representation, objects appearing in space and time, connected through causality, forever external to our direct knowledge. But our own body reveals itself uniquely. We know it as representation. Certainly we see our hands, observe our movements, watch ourselves in mirrors like any other object. Yet we also know this same body from within, through the immediate, non-representational experience of willing itself. This dual knowledge became Schopenhauer's philosophical key. When we reach for something, we don't first observe our arm moving and then infer some inner cause. The willing and the bodily movement are one reality known from two perspectives. The body, he realized, is nothing other than the objectivity of the will, the point where inner striving becomes outer appearance. Here, in our own embodied existence, the mysterious relationship between inner reality and outer phenomenon stands revealed. This insight provided Schopenhauer's solution to Kant's most troubling limitation. Kant had demonstrated conclusively that we can never penetrate beyond the forms of representation to know things as they exist independently of our cognitive apparatus. The thing in itself remained forever unknowable, leaving reality's true nature shrouded in impenetrable mystery. Philosophers after Kant struggled with this barrier, some denying its existence, others accepting permanent ignorance about ultimate reality. Schopenhauer's breakthrough came through recognizing that we already possess intimate knowledge of reality in itself. In the immediate experience of desire, effort, resistance, satisfaction, we encounter the thing in itself directly, not mediated through space, time, and causality. The thing in itself, which Kant declared unknowable, Schopenhauer proclaimed, is nothing other than what we know most intimately as our own will. But this will, once discovered, proved radically different from what philosophy had traditionally expected to find at reality's foundation. Schopenhauer's careful introspection revealed willing as fundamentally blind, striving rather than conscious purpose or intelligent design. The will operates without rational direction, without ultimate goals, without inherent wisdom guiding its activity. It is pure drive, restless, unconscious energy that asserts itself simply because it must. This blindness of will became central to Schopenhauer's vision. Traditional metaphysics had posited rational principles, divine intelligence. Schopenhauer discovered something far more disturbing. The will is essentially blind. It drives all activity, generates all striving, underlies all existence, yet possesses no plan, no final purpose, no inherent direction beyond its own perpetual self-assertion. Will acts not to achieve some rational end, but simply because willing is its nature. The implications of this discovery transformed everything. If what we experience as our deepest self, the driving force behind our desires, efforts, and actions, is actually the fundamental reality underlying all existence, then understanding will becomes the key to understanding both human nature and reality itself. We are not rational beings guided by conscious purposes, but manifestations of blind, cosmic striving that knows no rest, no final satisfaction, no ultimate goal. This recognition opened entirely new questions about the nature of suffering, the possibility of knowledge, and the structure of existence itself. Schopenhauer achieved perhaps philosophy's most radical insight when he recognized that the will, we discover within ourselves that restless, blind, striving we feel as desire, ambition, and need is not merely human, but the underlying reality of all existence. The same force that drives your hunger for knowledge or love is what pulls planets into orbit around stars, what draws iron filings toward magnets, what pushes roots through soil toward water, what physics describes as gravitational attraction, what biology calls growth and reproduction, what psychology terms desire and motivation, every D. These are all faces of the single metaphysical reality Schopenhauer called will. This discovery emerged from his recognition that, whilst we can only know the external world as representation, as phenomena appearing to consciousness through the forms of space, time, and causality, we have one unique point of access to reality itself. In our own bodies, we experience both representation and something more. We see our hand move, but we also feel the willing that moves it. We observe our heartbeat, but we also experience the life force that drives it. Here alone, Schopenhauer realized, we penetrate beyond the veil of phenomena to touch the thing in itself. But will, as Schopenhauer discovered, cannot be confined to human experience. If this force is truly the essence of our being, then it must be the essence of all being. The will that manifests as human desire also manifests as the oak tree's relentless growth toward sunlight, as the river's inexorable flow toward the sea, as the crystal's precise formation according to its inner law. The will appears in every force of nature, he declared, recognizing that what we call natural laws are simply will's consistent patterns of self-expression. This insight reveals the mechanism of what Schopenhauer called objectification. 7. How the one will appears as countless separate beings and forces. The unity of will becomes multiplicity through the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation operating through space and time. These forms of representation, which Kant had identified as structures of consciousness, serve to fragment the unified will into apparently separate manifestations. What appears as distinct objects, this stone, that tree, your neighbor, are actually the one will appearing to itself through the differentiating lens of space, time, and causality. The implications are staggering. Every boundary we perceive between self and world, between one being and another, exists only in representation. At the deepest level, the will that drives your ambitions is identical to the will that powers the storm, that shapes the mountain, that beats in your enemy's heart. The will is one, Schopenhauer insisted, but its phenomena are many. Yet, will does not manifest uniformly throughout nature. Schopenhauer discovered a hierarchy of objectification, with the same underlying reality expressing itself more clearly and completely in higher forms of life. In inorganic matter, gravity, magnetism, chemical affinity, will appears in its most basic form as simple, mechanical striving. In plant life, will gains elementary responsiveness, reaching toward nourishment and light. In animal consciousness, will achieves mobility and sensation, creating beings capable of pursuing their goals with increasing sophistication. Human consciousness represents will's highest objectification, MNC, the point where will becomes aware of itself. But this awareness initially serves will's own purposes. Intellect emerges as will's tool for better satisfying its needs, for navigating complex social environments, for securing survival and reproduction. Consciousness is not separate from will, but will's own creation, its most sophisticated instrument of self-assertion. This hierarchy explains why consciousness emerges at all. Will, in its blind striving, eventually creates forms capable of knowing, though this knowledge begins as mere servitude, to willing, only in rare moments, in aesthetic contemplation, in ethical recognition, in philosophical insight. Does consciousness transcend its role as will's servant and glimpse the true nature of reality? Schopenhauer's discovery dissolves the boundaries that seem most fundamental to ordinary experience. The will does not simply exist as an undifferentiated force. It manifests itself through a systematic hierarchy of increasing complexity and consciousness, each level representing a more sophisticated form of self-objectification. Schopenhauer identified this ascending ladder of existence with remarkable precision, showing how the blind striving at the heart of reality expresses itself through ever more elaborate forms. At the most elementary level, will objectifies itself through basic physical forces, gravity, magnetism, chemical affinity. These represent will's most primitive self-assertion, the raw drive to exist and affect other phenomena. A stone falling to earth, iron drawn to a magnet, elements combining in chemical reactions. These manifest will's fundamental nature as ceaseless striving, though without any trace of consciousness or awareness. Plant life represents the next grade of objectification. Here, will gains basic responsiveness and directed growth. The vine reaching toward sunlight, roots extending toward water, flowers opening and closing with the rhythms of day and night. These reveal will equipped with primitive sensitivity to its environment. Yet this remains unconscious striving, guided by what Schopenhauer called stimuli, rather than true perception. Animal existence marks a dramatic escalation in will's self-objectification. Now will possesses sensation, mobility, the predator stalking its prey, the bird building its nest, the herd animal fleeing danger. These demonstrate will armed with perception, memory, and complex behavioral patterns. Animals live in a world of motives rather than mere stimuli, capable of recognizing objects and responding to them with sophisticated strategies. Human consciousness represents will's highest achievement in self-objectification. Here, will gains conceptual thought, abstract reasoning, and most crucially, self-awareness. Humans can contemplate their own existence, plan for distant futures, create art and philosophy, and understand the very nature of will itself. Through human consciousness, first, will achieves something unprecedented. First, the capacity to know itself. This hierarchy reveals a profound pattern. Each ascending level represents will knowing itself more clearly through increasingly sophisticated forms of manifestation. The stone knows nothing of itself. The plant responds unconsciously to its needs. The animal perceives its world, and the human being can contemplate existence itself. Yet Schopenhauer recognized that this progression follows eternal patterns he called ideas, timeless archetypes of will's self-objectification drawn from Plato but given new metaphysical significance. The idea of gravity, the idea of the rose, the idea of humanity. Individual stones fall and crumble, particular roses bloom and wither, human beings are born and die, but the ideas remain constant as the unchanging ways will objectifies itself. Ideas represent the immediate objectivity of the will, more fundamental than individual phenomena, but less fundamental than will itself. This creates a tragic irony that Schopenhauer perceived with devastating clarity. Higher levels of objectification involve greater consciousness, but also exponentially greater capacity for suffering. The stone cannot suffer. The plant suffers minimally. The animal suffers considerably. But the human being suffers most intensely precisely because human consciousness can anticipate future pain, remember past anguish, and imagine alternatives to present circumstances. With consciousness comes not liberation, but intensified torment. The ultimate philosophical paradox emerges. Consciousness, representing will's highest achievement in self-objectification, becomes the source of will's greatest suffering and potentially its own transcendence. Human awareness, initially serving will's purposes through enhanced survival and reproduction, eventually develops the capacity to understand will's nature and question its fundamental value. Part 3. The Philosophy of Suffering. All satisfaction, or what is commonly called happiness, is really and essentially always negative only, and never positive. With this devastating insight, Schopenhauer revealed the fundamental structure of conscious existence, ABR, a structure that condemns us to swing endlessly between two poles of human misery. Life operates like a pendulum, he observed, oscillating relentlessly between want and boredom. When we lack what we desire, we suffer from the acute pain of wanting, feeling the absence of our object as a positive torment. When we obtain what we desire, we discover not the positive pleasure we anticipated, but merely temporary relief, I. There exists no stable middle ground of contentment, no resting place where consciousness might find peace. We are condemned to perpetual motion between these two forms of dissatisfaction, never finding the equilibrium we desperately seek. The mechanism driving this pendulum lies in Schopenhauer's penetrating analysis of desire and satisfaction. Wanting creates suffering through the immediate experience of lack. We feel the absence of what we desire as genuine pain, as uncomfortable as physical hunger or thirst. The lover separated from his beloved, the ambitious man denied promotion, the poor man lacking necessities. Each experiences their want as positive discomfort, a real and pressing torment. Satisfaction, however, provides not positive pleasure, but merely temporary relief from this pain, like the blessed cessation of a headache. All satisfaction is negative, Schopenhauer insisted. What we mistake for pleasure is simply the momentary absence of pain, whilst pain itself is always positively and directly felt. A man eating when hungry experiences relief from the pain of hunger, not positive pleasure in eating. This asymmetry reveals suffering as the substantial reality of existence, whilst happiness proves merely the temporary absence of suffering. Every fulfilled desire births new desires in an endless, exhausting cycle. Schopenhauer recognized that satisfaction never brings permanent peace, because will, as blind striving, cannot be permanently satisfied. Its very essence is to want, and eliminating one want only creates space for another to emerge. The successful businessman dreams of greater wealth. The acclaimed artist craves wider recognition. The satisfied lover seeks new conquests. The will is essentially insatiable, driven by its own nature to perpetual striving. Each achievement reveals itself as merely a stepping stone to fresh desires, fresh dissatisfactions, fresh suffering. The pursuit of happiness through desire satisfaction proves fundamentally futile. We chase mirages across an endless desert of wanting. This analysis yields Schopenhauer's mathematical proof of pessimism. Suffering is positive and directly experienced, whilst pleasure consists only in the temporary absence of pain. This structural asymmetry guarantees that life contains more suffering than happiness, not through unfortunate circumstances, but through the very nature of willing consciousness. Pain outweighs pleasure, frustration outweighs satisfaction. Boredom outweighs contentment. Not accidentally, but necessarily. Life is essentially suffering, and any honest assessment of existence must acknowledge this fundamental truth. The pendulum swings, and we swing with it, trapped in oscillation between forms of misery that reveal suffering as woven into the very fabric of existence as will. Schopenhauer discovered something profoundly unsettling about the nature of human conflict. What we experience as natural competition between separate individuals is actually a cosmic delusion, a metaphysical mistake that generates unnecessary suffering on an enormous scale. The very appearance of separation that makes you seem fundamentally different from every other person is Maya, the veil of illusion that obscures our true nature. Space and time, those basic forms through which we perceive reality, create what Schopenhauer called the principium individuationis, LAS, the principle of individuation. This principle takes the one universal will and makes it appear as countless separate beings, each seemingly isolated in its own body, its own mind, its own interests. You experience yourself as fundamentally distinct from others because space separates your body from theirs, and time separates your experiences from theirs. But this separation exists only in representation, not in the underlying reality. This illusion of separateness generates what appears to be a natural law of competition. If I believe I am fundamentally different from you, then your gain seems to threaten my security. Your happiness appears to diminish the happiness available to me. Your success feels like evidence of my inadequacy. The world appears to offer limited resources, limited recognition, limited love, and if you get more, I must get less. This creates what Schopenhauer recognized as the war of all against all, not because humans are inherently evil, but because we are operating under a fundamental metaphysical misunderstanding. The tragedy deepens when we realize what this competition actually involves. When I struggle against you, when I seek to defeat or exploit you, when I treat your interests as naturally opposed to mine, I am literally fighting against my own deepest essence appearing in a different form. The will that drives your desires is the same will that drives mine. The consciousness that experiences your suffering is the same consciousness that experiences my satisfaction. Schopenhauer captured this with devastating clarity. The tormentor and the tormented are one. This insight reveals the profound futility of all conflict based on the illusion of separateness. Every victory achieved through harming others is ultimately self-defeating, because the will that suffers in the victim is the same will that acts in the perpetrator. Every moment of satisfaction gained at another's expense is hollow, because it depends on ignoring our fundamental unity. We spend our lives fighting shadows of ourselves, competing with manifestations of our own essence, seeking to defeat what we actually are. But Schopenhauer also saw the transformative potential in recognizing this truth. When the veil of Maya lifts, when we see through the illusion of separateness, the basis for hostility and competition simply dissolves. This isn't a moral achievement requiring tremendous effort or faith. It's a natural consequence of clear philosophical understanding. Once you truly grasp that, apparent others are actually manifestations of the same will you know as your deepest self. Compassion emerges spontaneously. This recognition becomes the foundation for a completely different way of being in the world. Instead of the endless cycle of competition and conflict generated by the illusion of separateness, we discover the possibility of genuine ethics based on our actual metaphysical situation. The understanding that all beings share the same essential nature doesn't just change how we think about morality, it transforms the entire basis of human relationships and points toward the possibility of transcending suffering that competition inevitably creates. Schopenhauer delivered one of philosophy's most devastating insights. The will that drives all existence is nothing more than blind striving without purpose, goal, or ultimate meaning. This is not merely the observation that we sometimes pursue foolish objectives, or that our plans occasionally fail. Rather, it is the recognition that will itself, the fundamental force behind all activity, all desire, all ambition, is pure activity for its own sake, lacking any inherent wisdom, direction, or worthwhile destination. The will wills, but it knows not what it wills. Every project that seems urgent and meaningful to us, every achievement that appears significant, every ambition that consumes our energy, serves no ultimate purpose beyond keeping this blind machinery in perpetual motion. This insight transforms our understanding of human endeavor entirely. Our achievements become meaningless not because they fail to accomplish their immediate goals, but because those goals themselves serve no ultimate purpose. Whether we succeed brilliantly or fail catastrophically, whether we build magnificent civilizations or watch them crumble into dust, whether we create sublime works of art or see them decay into nothing, none of it matters beyond its function as fuel for will's endless self-perpetuation. Schopenhauer recognized that life has no meaning beyond itself. We strive in order to continue striving, not because striving leads anywhere worthwhile. The businessman pursues wealth to secure happiness that never arrives. The artist creates beauty that provides only momentary satisfaction before demanding new creation. The lover seeks union that dissolves into familiarity and renewed longing. The generational cycle reveals this futility most clearly. Each generation repeats identical patterns of desire, struggle, temporary satisfaction, and ultimate disappointment, only to produce a new generation destined for the same meaningless repetition. Parents sacrifice their present happiness for children who will sacrifice their happiness for their children, in an infinite series that leads nowhere. Schopenhauer observed how each generation imagines itself uniquely positioned to find meaning and fulfillment, yet inevitably discovers the same fundamental emptiness that plagued their predecessors. The cycle continues not because it serves any purpose, but because will demands its own continuation through biological reproduction and cultural transmission. Even love and reproduction, which feel most meaningful and natural to us, serve only will's blind perpetuation rather than genuine human fulfillment. Romantic love, which seems so personal and significant, is actually will's most powerful illusion, a strategy for ensuring reproduction disguised as individual choice and happiness. We believe we are selecting partners for our own joy when we are actually being manipulated into creating the next generation of sufferers. The intensity of romantic passion corresponds precisely to will's reproductive requirements, not to our authentic needs or genuine compatibility. Once reproduction is secured, the illusion typically fades, leaving confusion and disappointment where transcendent meaning seemed guaranteed. This recognition that all striving serves only will's meaningless self-perpetuation creates the foundation for Schopenhauer's entire philosophy of suffering, while simultaneously pointing toward the possibility of genuine escape through aesthetic contemplation and ethical insight. Part 4. The Aesthetic Experience. Arthur Schopenhauer discovered something extraordinary hidden within our everyday experience of beauty. Moments when consciousness achieves its first genuine escape from the tyranny of will. These are not mere pleasurable experiences or refined cultural appreciations, but profound transformations of awareness itself. When we become completely absorbed in the pure perception of a sunset's colors bleeding across the horizon, or find ourselves utterly captivated by the mathematical precision of a Bach fugue, something remarkable occurs. We temporarily forget our own willing, desiring, suffering individual existence entirely. Schopenhauer identified these specific moments with scientific precision. They arrive when natural beauty, artistic creation, or sublime phenomena capture our attention so completely that all personal concerns, practical interests, and individual identity dissolve. We no longer experience ourselves as particular persons with specific needs, desires, and anxieties. Instead, as he described it, we are no longer conscious of ourselves as individuals, but become pure subjects of knowing, consciousness freed from the prison of personal perspective. This transformation reveals something profound about the nature of ordinary experience. In aesthetic contemplation, the principle of sufficient reason that normally governs our perception suddenly suspends its operation. We no longer see objects as existing in spatial and temporal relations, as causes and effects, or as means to our personal ends. The flower before us is no longer something that exists at a particular time and place, that grew from specific seeds that might serve our purposes or remind us of past experiences. Instead, we apprehend it as it is in itself, independent of all relations and connections to our individual will. Schopenhauer recognized that the object is no longer perceived as existing for the will, but is contemplated purely for its own sake. This represents a complete reversal of normal consciousness. Usually, we encounter objects through the lens of our desires and needs. This chair might be comfortable. That painting might be valuable. This landscape might be suitable for our purposes. But in genuine aesthetic experience, all such practical considerations vanish. We perceive without wanting, observe without judging, apprehend without calculating. The transformation of the subject proves even more remarkable than the transformation of the object. The individual person, I, with particular interests, desires, concerns, and anxieties, I, temporarily disappears entirely. This is not gradual, but sudden and complete. One moment we exist as suffering, striving individuals caught in the web of personal willing. The next, we have become what Schopenhauer called pure will-less knowing. Impersonal awareness that belongs to no particular person and serves no particular interest. As he put it, in aesthetic contemplation, the individual as such disappears. This disappearance represents genuine liberation, not mere distraction or entertainment. Aesthetic experience provides the first taste of what existence might be like without suffering, because it proves that consciousness can exist without willing. We discover that awareness can function without desire, that we can apprehend reality without the mediation of personal interest. The chronic anxiety, restless striving, and persistent dissatisfaction that characterize ordinary existence simply cease to exist during these moments of pure perception. Schopenhauer's insight cuts to the heart of human possibility. Aesthetic experience reveals the possibility of redemption from the will and provides direct evidence that liberation from suffering is not merely theoretical, but actually achievable. Every person has experienced these moments, however briefly, standing before a work of art that renders them speechless, losing themselves in music that seems to speak directly to something beyond individual personality, or finding their breath taken away by natural beauty that demands nothing but pure attention. These experiences prove that the boundaries of individual selfhood are not absolute. They demonstrate that consciousness possesses capacities beyond the service of personal will, that awareness can transcend the limitations of particular perspective and individual striving. Aesthetic experience lifts consciousness from the realm of particular temporal objects to apprehend eternal universal patterns, sees what Schopenhauer called ideas, following Plato, whilst giving them revolutionary metaphysical significance as the direct objectifications of will itself. When we stand before a masterpiece, something extraordinary occurs in consciousness. We no longer see this particular rose painted on canvas, this individual human face carved in marble, or this specific landscape rendered in oils. Instead, we apprehend the eternal idea of the rose, of humanity, of natural beauty, timeless forms that manifest through countless particular instances across space and time. Schopenhauer recognized that aesthetic contemplation has ideas as its object. We transcend the world of individual things, governed by causality and succession, to grasp the eternal patterns through which will objectifies itself in the phenomenal world. These ideas serve as the objective content of aesthetic experience, providing universal knowledge that transcends temporal particularity, whilst remaining immediately accessible to intuitive apprehension. Schopenhauer understood that ideas occupy a unique position in the architecture of knowledge. They are neither abstract concepts produced by discursive reasoning nor individual objects existing in space and time. Rather, they are eternal patterns that can be directly perceived by consciousness, freed from the tyranny of willing. This makes aesthetic knowledge both immediate like perception and universal like concepts, yet superior to both because it grasps reality directly rather than through mediating forms. When consciousness achieves this state of pure knowing, it apprehends what will is like in its essential nature, not as blind striving force, but as eternal forms of beauty, sublimity, and truth. Great artworks accomplish something miraculous. They make the invisible visible and render the universal particular through artistic forms that invite pure contemplation. Art doesn't simply copy individual objects or create pleasing arrangements of sensuous materials. Instead, as Schopenhauer recognized, art reproduces the eternal ideas and makes them accessible to consciousness through beautiful objects that transcend their material limitations. A portrait by Rembrandt reveals not just the features of a particular person, but the idea of humanity itself, the eternal patterns of character, emotion, and spiritual depth that define human nature across all its individual manifestations. A landscape by Claude reveals not merely this specific scene, but the idea of natural beauty that underlies all particular instances of scenic grandeur. This aesthetic knowledge provides a cognitive transformation that bypasses conceptual reasoning whilst revealing universal patterns underlying all phenomena. Unlike philosophical argument or scientific investigation, aesthetic insight gives us direct access to the fundamental structures of reality without requiring mediation through abstract thought. Schopenhauer's profound insight was that aesthetic knowledge is immediate knowledge of ideas. It shows us what will is like in its eternal self-objectifications, not filtered through the forms of space, time, and causality that govern ordinary experience, but as it exists in its essential nature. This explains why genuine aesthetic experience feels like revelation rather than mere appreciation. We recognize eternal truths about reality itself, not just skillful arrangements of artistic materials. Different art forms provide different pathways to this transcendent knowledge, each uniquely suited to reveal particular aspects of the ideas through which will manifests its deepest nature. Schopenhauer constructed a systematic hierarchy of the arts, ranking them according to which ideas they reveal and how directly they present eternal truths to aesthetic contemplation. This wasn't arbitrary classification, but philosophical necessity. Each art form corresponds to a specific level of will's objectification, from the most basic physical forces to will's own inner essence. Architecture occupies the lowest position because it reveals the ideas of inorganic forces: gravity, cohesion, resistance, the fundamental powers through which will first manifests itself in the material world. When we contemplate a Gothic cathedral or Greek temple, we witness the visible expression of these basic forces: the play of support and load, gravitational pressure resolved through structural harmony, geometric relationships that make manifest the inorganic will's striving for stability and form. Sculpture advances higher by revealing the idea of human physical perfection. Greek sculpture particularly fascinated Schopenhauer because it transcends copying particular bodies to present the eternal form of human embodiment itself. The Apollo Belvedere or Venus de Milo don't reproduce specific individuals but reveal humanity's ideal physical form, freed from individual imperfections and temporal decay. Here we encounter will's objectification at the level of organic life, but still focused on external form rather than inner experience. Painting and poetry reveal significantly higher ideas by making visible the inner life of organic beings, human emotions, and moral relationships. Painting's power lies in capturing not merely external appearance, but inner character. The way a face reveals personality beneath surface features, a landscape reveals natural forces in dynamic tension, a historical scene reveals human motivations and conflicts that transcend the particular moment depicted. The greatest paintings present universal human types and situations that speak to eternal aspects of experience. Rather than documenting temporary circumstances, poetry, especially tragic poetry, reveals the highest ideas by presenting universal patterns of human experience that transcend historical particularity. When Sophocles dramatizes Oedipus's fate, or Shakespeare explores Hamlet's psychological torment, they're not simply telling individual stories but revealing eternal structures of human existence. The patterns of love, loss, heroism, suffering, and moral conflict that define our condition across all times and cultures. Poetry achieves this through language's unique capacity to represent both concrete particulars and abstract universals simultaneously. Yet music stands apart from this entire hierarchy because it doesn't represent ideas at all but directly expresses will itself. Music bypasses representation entirely and provides immediate access to the metaphysical reality underlying all phenomena. Schopenhauer's revolutionary insight was that music is the direct copy of the will itself. It doesn't show us will's objectifications in the phenomenal world, but lets us experience will's own inner movement, its striving, resistance, temporary satisfaction, and renewed striving. The bass notes correspond to inorganic matter's dull persistence, the melody to conscious desire's fluid movement, harmony to the resolution of conflict, rhythm to time's essential structure. This explains music's unique emotional power. When we hear a symphony, we're not contemplating ideas about reality, but directly experiencing reality's inner essence. We recognize our own deepest nature in musical forms because music speaks the same language as our inner will. The aesthetic experience music provides is therefore the most complete liberation from individuation. We lose ourselves not in contemplating eternal ideas, but in participating directly in the universal. Well, that constitutes our true being. This hierarchy points toward aesthetic experience's ultimate significance. Whilst providing temporary liberation from willing, it reveals the possibility of more permanent transcendence through ethics and compassion, where recognition of will's universality becomes the foundation for moral action. Part 5. Ethics and Compassion. Schopenhauer revolutionized moral philosophy by sweeping away centuries of ethical theory built on duty and consequence, declaring that compassion alone provides genuine moral motivation. Where Kant erected his categorical imperative as the foundation of ethics, demanding we act from duty regardless of inclination, Schopenhauer saw only disguised egoism. Where utilitarians calculated the greatest good for the greatest number, he recognized elaborate self-interest, masquerading as moral concern. Against both traditions, he proclaimed that actions possess moral worth only when they spring from direct emotional identification with others' suffering, OBH, when compassion, not calculation or obligation, moves us to act. This insight cut deeper than mere disagreement with existing moral theories. Schopenhauer recognized that what philosophers had mistaken for moral motivation, duty, social pressure, fear of consequences, were actually sophisticated forms of egoism, serving the agent's own interests. The person who helps another from duty serves their self-image as moral. The utilitarian calculator serves their intellectual satisfaction. The socially conscious actor serves their reputation. Only compassion transcends self-interest, because only compassion recognizes that the other's suffering is not truly other at all. Here, Schopenhauer's ethics merged with his metaphysics in profound recognition. Genuine compassion arises when we see through the veil of Maya to recognize that others' suffering is ultimately our own, not metaphorically, but metaphysically. The will suffering in another being is the same will that constitutes our own deepest essence. This recognition, captured in the Sanskrit formula he adopted, Tat Tavam Asi, that art thou, reveals that what appears as another's pain is actually the pain of our own true self, appearing through the illusion of separation created by space and time. This mystical insight dissolves the very distinction between self and other that normally governs human action. When we truly recognize another being as ourselves appearing in different form, their welfare becomes as important to us as our own. Their suffering becomes our suffering. Their joy becomes our joy. The boundaries between individuals reveal themselves as constructions of Maya rather than ultimate reality. In moments of genuine compassion, as Schopenhauer observed, the metaphysical truth breaks through, showing us the world as it truly is beneath appearances. Only actions motivated by this compassionate recognition possess true moral worth. Moral rules and utilitarian calculations can produce externally correct behavior, but they cannot create genuinely moral motivation. A person may follow every ethical principle, maximize utility in every decision, yet remain fundamentally egoistic if their actions serve their own interests. Any age, whether material, social, or psychological, morality begins where egoism ends. And this ending requires metaphysical insight, not merely ethical reasoning. The recognition that others are ourselves appearing in different forms transforms action from calculated self-interest into genuine moral response. Schopenhauer's conception of justice strikes at the very foundation of moral philosophy. With a startling insight, justice is not positive virtue, but negative compassion. The recognition that others possess the same fundamental claim to existence and welfare that we naturally claim for ourselves. This represents the first crack in the prison of pure egoism, the initial breakthrough of the principium individuationis that reveals our separateness as illusory. When we act justly, We acknowledge that the suffering of another carries the same metaphysical weight as our own, even whilst we may not yet feel moved to alleviate it actively. Justice emerges precisely when we recognize that others have equal right to pursue their interests and avoid harm, even when their welfare conflicts directly with our immediate desires. Schopenhauer captured this recognition in his penetrating observation. Justice says, "This is not mine, but his." The just person has begun to see through Maya's veil sufficiently to understand that exclusive claims to happiness and security cannot be sustained, that the will to live manifests equally in all conscious beings, making each person's fundamental interests as valid as our own. This is not mere social convention, but metaphysical truth, breaking through phenomenal appearances. This recognition of equal claim serves as the only legitimate foundation for social order and legal systems. Schopenhauer argued that valid law and governance must rest on the basic acknowledgement of shared vulnerability and equal right to protection from harm, ever. Not because of social contract theories or divine commandments, but because of the underlying reality of our shared essence as manifestations of will. Legal systems function effectively only when they embody the principle that each person's welfare matters as much as every other person's. The state exists, as Schopenhauer recognized, to protect each from all and all from each, creating the conditions where equal claims can be honored without constant conflict. Yet, justice represents merely the first stage of moral development, a primarily negative recognition that refrains from harm rather than actively promoting welfare. The just person has begun to see through Maya, but only partially. They recognize others' equal right to exist and pursue happiness, but they don't yet identify completely with others' welfare as their own. Justice draws the line between legitimate self-assertion and illegitimate aggression against others, but it doesn't dissolve the line entirely. This limitation reveals justice's incompleteness. Whilst it prevents us from harming others and establishes the framework for peaceful coexistence, it doesn't motivate us to help them actively. Justice maintains the basic structure of separate individuals with competing interests, even whilst acknowledging equal claims within that structure. True compassion transcends these boundaries entirely, moving beyond negative restraint toward positive identification with all suffering beings. Arthur Schopenhauer discovered something profound about the nature of genuine love. It represents nothing less than the complete transcendence of egoistic motivation through full recognition of our metaphysical unity. This compassionate love stands as active concern for others' welfare that extends to self-sacrifice when necessary for their genuine benefit, marking the breakthrough moment when we care more for another's well-being than for our own survival or happiness. Schopenhauer distinguished this moral love sharply from what we commonly mistake for love. Romantic passion serves the will's reproductive purposes, driving us toward genetic continuation through the illusion of personal attraction. Familial affection serves genetic self-interest, protecting those who share our biological inheritance. But genuine, compassionate love operates from an entirely different foundation, the direct recognition that the suffering being before us is ourselves in the most literal metaphysical sense. This loving kindness, as Schopenhauer termed it, represents the positive breakthrough of recognizing that others are ourselves. We don't simply refrain from causing harm, we actively promote their well-being as if it were our own, because we have seen through the illusion of separation that makes egoism seem rational. The mother who sacrifices her life for her child, the stranger who risks everything to save someone from drowning, the saint who dedicates existence entirely to alleviating suffering. These represent moments when the truth of our underlying unity breaks through the veil of individual consciousness. Universal compassion extends this recognition beyond human beings to all sentient life. Schopenhauer realized that genuine moral love can extend to any being capable of suffering, regardless of personal connection, because it's based on recognition of shared essence rather than biological or social bonds. The same will that strives and suffers in us strives and suffers in every conscious creature. Here emerges a profound paradox of moral development. By losing concern for the individual self, one discovers the true self as universal will and achieves the only genuine form of self-realization possible. Those who sacrifice individual interests for others' welfare don't lose themselves but find their deeper identity as the will that suffers and strives in all beings. This creates a complete transformation of identity, from identification with the particular individual to identification with the universal essence that manifests in all conscious beings. Schopenhauer pointed to saints and moral exemplars as those who have fully realized the illusory nature of separation through lived compassion. Buddha, Jesus, and various Christian and Hindu saints represent complete moral development. Individuals who had so fully recognized the unity underlying apparent multiplicity that they naturally acted for others' welfare without any sense of sacrifice or loss. They had seen through the principium individuationis and lived from the recognition that helping others is helping themselves in the most literal metaphysical sense. These figures become living demonstrations that liberation from egoism is possible, that the recognition of universal suffering can transform into universal compassion. They point toward the ultimate possibility that Schopenhauer glimpsed beyond even compassionate action, the complete denial of the will to live itself. Part 6. The denial of the will to live. Schopenhauer identified the most profound possibility available to human consciousness, the complete denial of the will to live itself. This represents far more than ordinary despair or dissatisfaction with particular circumstances. When consciousness achieves sufficient clarity about the nature of will and the universality of suffering, it can experience such complete revulsion against existence that it turns against the very drive to live, strive, and want anything at all. Schopenhauer distinguished this radical transformation from common depression or melancholy, which typically seeks better conditions for willing rather than the cessation of willing itself. The knowledge of the whole, seeing clearly what will is and what it inevitably produces across all existence, can generate such thoroughgoing disillusionment that consciousness rejects not just specific frustrations, but the entire project of being a willing, desiring creature. This denial of will to live stands fundamentally apart from suicide, which Schopenhauer argued actually affirms life by rejecting only particular circumstances rather than willing itself. Suicide springs from frustrated willing, the desperate desire for different conditions, better circumstances, or escape from specific unbearable problems. The person who takes their own life remains trapped within the logic of wanting. They want relief, want escape, want an end to particular sufferings. As Schopenhauer observed, the suicide wills life and is dissatisfied merely with the conditions on which it has come to him. The suicidal person has not transcended desire, but has been overwhelmed by it. In contrast, the saint or sage who achieves denial of will no longer wills life itself. They have moved beyond wanting anything. Including the want to escape through death. This transformation represents the ultimate philosophical and existential achievement within Schopenhauer's system because it constitutes complete liberation from the cycle of desire, temporary satisfaction, boredom, and renewed desire that characterizes all willing existence. When consciousness ceases to will, it ceases to suffer, because suffering has its root in the gap between what we want and what we possess. The denial of will to live eliminates suffering by eliminating its source, wanting itself. This state represents what Schopenhauer called the complete victory over the will to live, the achievement of perfect peace through the elimination of all striving, all attachment, all investment in outcomes or possessions or experiences. Yet, this attainment remains extraordinarily rare precisely because it requires more than intellectual understanding. Most conscious beings remain trapped in the cycle of desire, despite recognizing its inevitable frustration, because knowing about the problem differs fundamentally from the complete transformation of one's relationship to existence itself. Denial of will demands a change so profound that it amounts to the death of the individual personality, AG, with all its wants, fears, preferences, and attachments, and the emergence of a completely different mode of being. Schopenhauer recognized this achievement as the rarest of all phenomena, requiring not only philosophical insight and moral development, but what can only be described as grace or spontaneous transformation. The question becomes whether any practices or disciplines might prepare consciousness for this ultimate liberation from the tyranny of willing. The will must use itself to destroy itself. This paradox lies at the heart of Schopenhauer's understanding of asceticism, revealing perhaps the most puzzling aspect of his entire philosophical system. How can the very faculty that creates all suffering become the instrument of liberation from suffering? The philosophical puzzle runs deeper than mere contradiction. It exposes the extraordinary complexity of consciousness, attempting to transcend its own fundamental nature. Schopenhauer recognized that ascetic practices require initial willing. The decision to renounce pleasure demands will. The effort to resist temptation employs will. The discipline to maintain practices depends entirely upon will. Yet these same practices aim at the complete cessation of willing altogether. The ascetic begins by affirming the will through acts of denial, using desire to eliminate desire, employing striving to end striving. This creates what appears to be an impossible logical circle, NBA, will working against itself, whilst simultaneously depending upon itself for the very capacity to work. The resolution emerges through understanding asceticism not as violent suppression, but as systematic weakening of will's habitual dominance over consciousness. Traditional ascetic disciplines serve a precise philosophical function. Fasting breaks the automatic cycle of desire and satisfaction that keeps consciousness trapped in willing. Celibacy eliminates the most powerful force through which will maintains its control over awareness. Poverty removes the objects that stimulate wanting. Solitude creates conditions where consciousness can experience itself, independent of the social dynamics that constantly trigger competitive striving. These practices work by creating gaps, moments where consciousness exists without willing, where awareness functions without desire, where the mind operates without the constant pressure of want. Through deliberate rejection of pleasure, comfort, and natural satisfactions, the ascetic gradually weakens the identification between awareness and desire that normally appears absolute. Consciousness begins to recognize itself as something distinct from willing, something that can observe desire without being consumed by it. Schopenhauer understood that asceticism mortifies the will by systematically refusing to feed its demands for satisfaction. Like a fire deprived of fuel, willing gradually weakens, when consciousness stops providing the attention and energy that sustain it. The ascetic discovers that desires lose their compulsive power when consistently denied the satisfaction that reinforces them. What seemed like permanent features of human nature reveal themselves as habits that can be broken through persistent non-cooperation. Yet Schopenhauer warned against confusing genuine asceticism with mere external renunciation. The crucial distinction lies between practices that spring from insight into will's nature and those motivated by egoistic concerns. Spiritual pride, fear of punishment, desire for reward. I see. These transform ascetic disciplines into new forms of willing rather than liberation from willing. The monk who fasts to achieve holiness remains trapped in wanting. The hermit who seeks solitude to escape worldly concerns simply creates more subtle attachments. External renunciation without inner transformation becomes meaningless theater, often more destructive than honest worldliness. True asceticism cannot be willed in the ordinary sense, because it emerges spontaneously from clear seeing rather than forced discipline. When consciousness genuinely understands that all willing produces suffering, renunciation becomes natural rather than heroic. The authentic ascetic doesn't struggle against desire, but sees through the illusion that satisfaction is possible. This seeing transforms the entire relationship between consciousness and willing, making denial effortless because there's no longer anyone who wants what is being denied. The goal reveals itself as the natural absence of desire, rather than its forcible suppression. In complete denial of will, renunciation becomes effortless because willing itself has ceased. Consciousness no longer generates wants, attachments, or aversions because it has seen through the fundamental illusion that drives them all. Schopenhauer confronted the ultimate philosophical question: what remains when the will to live turns against itself and achieves complete self-denial? Here we encounter the profound limitation of philosophical discourse itself. All our concepts, all our language, every tool of rational analysis emerges from willing consciousness. How then can we positively describe what lies beyond willing? Schopenhauer acknowledged this fundamental impossibility with characteristic intellectual honesty. The state of salvation cannot be captured in positive terms because our entire conceptual apparatus belongs to the world of representation, which is itself the will's own creation. Yet this limitation does not render the inquiry meaningless. Schopenhauer could characterize this state through systematic negation. It is not suffering, not striving, not wanting, not fearing, not hoping, not regretting. The liberated consciousness experiences no anxiety about future loss because there is nothing it seeks to possess. It knows no disappointment because it harbors no expectations. It suffers no jealousy, no hatred, no despair, because the very mechanism that generates these torments, individual willing, has been completely transcended. As Schopenhauer recognized, what remains after the complete abolition of the will is, for all who are still full of the will, assuredly nothing. But conversely, to those in whom the will has turned and denied itself, this very real world of ours, with all its suns and galaxies, is nothing. This apparent nothingness reveals itself as the achievement of everything that willing consciousness desperately seeks but can never find. Perfect peace replaces the endless oscillation between want and boredom. Complete freedom from suffering emerges not through the satisfaction of desires, but through their total absence. Pure knowledge exists without personal perspective, without individual interest, without the distorting lens of self-concern. The liberated consciousness knows reality directly, without the mediation of personal will, without the constant question, what does this mean for me? This state represents not the absence of consciousness, but consciousness purified of willing, awareness that exists without wanting, knowing that occurs without personal agenda. The individual perspective dissolves, but what remains is not blank unconsciousness, but rather consciousness freed from the prison of individuality. Schopenhauer discovered that his philosophical analysis converged remarkably with the experiential reports of contemplatives across cultures and centuries. Buddhist nirvana, Hindu moksha, Christian mystical union, HNI, all point toward this same fundamental possibility. The complete transcendence of individual willing, the achievement of a state beyond suffering, the dissolution of the barrier between self and world. Schopenhauer's genius lay in providing Western rational justification for what Eastern wisdom traditions had long taught through meditation, asceticism, and direct spiritual practice. His philosophy demonstrated that the mystical goal was not mere wishful thinking, but the logical culmination of understanding reality's deepest structure. Yet this convergence raises Schopenhauer's most troubling question. Does this rare possibility of liberation justify the vast ocean of suffering that existence entails? If salvation is achievable, but extremely difficult, if most conscious beings remain trapped in willing's endless cycle, can existence as a whole be considered worthwhile? His philosophy leaves us with the fundamental choice: continue willing, and therefore suffering, or seek the complete denial of will, through whatever means might prove effective. Philosophy can demonstrate liberation's possibility, but cannot compel anyone to seek it. Each individual must ultimately decide whether existence's game is worth playing, or whether wisdom demands seeking the complete cessation of willing itself. This recognition would drive Schopenhauer toward deeper engagement with Eastern philosophical traditions, where such questions had been explored for millennia. Part 7. Eastern Wisdom and Western Philosophy. Schopenhauer's philosophical journey took an extraordinary turn when he encountered the Upanishads through Friedrich Mager's Latin translation, the Upnekhat. This discovery struck him with the force of recognition rather than revelation. In these ancient Sanskrit texts, he found the very insights his own rigorous philosophical investigations had independently revealed. The experience was nothing short of transformative. He declared that the Upanishads had been the consolation of my life and will be the consolation of my death, comparing the experience of reading them to breathing mountain air after being confined in a dungeon. This wasn't mere philosophical enthusiasm. It was the profound recognition that two entirely separate traditions of inquiry, a systematic Western philosophy and ancient Indian wisdom, had arrived at identical conclusions about the fundamental nature of reality. The parallels were indeed remarkable. Schopenhauer's concept of will as the underlying reality behind all phenomena corresponded precisely to the Hindu understanding of Brahman, Eniuse, the ultimate, undifferentiated reality that manifests as all apparent multiplicity. His analysis of the world as representation matched perfectly with the Indian teaching of Maya, the cosmic illusion that creates the appearance of separate objects and individual selves whilst concealing the underlying unity, where his philosophy demonstrated that the phenomenal world was merely appearance, conditioned by the forms of space, time, and causality. The Upanishads taught that all multiplicity was Maya, appearance rather than ultimate truth. The Sanskrit concept of samsara, the endless cycle of suffering driven by ignorance of our true nature, aligned seamlessly with his analysis of how the will to live perpetuates itself through countless individual manifestations, each trapped in the illusion of separateness and driven by insatiable desires. Buddhist teachings provided even more precise confirmation of his philosophical conclusions. The Four Noble Truths, the universality of suffering, its origin in craving, the possibility of its cessation, and the path to liberation, matched his systematic demonstration with extraordinary accuracy. Buddha's analysis of dukkha, suffering, as the fundamental characteristic of existence, corresponded to his own philosophical proof that all willing necessarily involves suffering. The Buddhist concept of tanha, craving, as the root cause of suffering aligned perfectly with his analysis of will as the blind, irrational force that drives all phenomena. Most significantly, the Buddhist promise of nirvana through the complete elimination of craving matched his own conclusion that liberation required the total denial of the will to live. He recognized that Buddhism provided the clearest and most systematic presentation of truths he had discovered through purely rational philosophical methods. Schopenhauer considered himself the first Western philosopher capable of truly understanding and incorporating Eastern wisdom rather than merely cataloging it as exotic curiosity or dismissing it as primitive superstition. Previous European thinkers had either ignored Eastern philosophy entirely or fundamentally misunderstood it through Christian theological assumptions and rationalist prejudices. His philosophical system provided the conceptual framework necessary for Western minds to grasp what Eastern traditions had always taught, that existence is essentially characterized by suffering, that this suffering has a discoverable metaphysical cause, and that complete liberation is possible through the radical transformation of consciousness itself. The universe operates according to perfect justice, but not the kind we imagine. Schopenhauer discovered that karma functions not as cosmic bookkeeping, but as metaphysical necessity. Every act of cruelty rebounds on the actor because the separation between tormentor and victim is pure illusion. When you harm another, you literally harm yourself. This isn't moral metaphor but metaphysical fact about the unity underlying apparent multiplicity. The will that appears as your individual consciousness is the same will manifesting as every other being. Schopenhauer recognized that the tormentor and the tormented are one, not symbolically, but actually. The hand that strikes and the face that receives the blow are both expressions of identical will, temporarily appearing as separate entities. Karma operates through this fundamental truth. What you do to others, you do to yourself, because there is ultimately no other in the deepest sense. This understanding transforms our conception of rebirth entirely. Schopenhauer argued that whilst individual consciousness perishes completely at death, will itself cannot be destroyed and must continue manifesting in new forms. The empirical person, your memories, personality, specific characteristics, dies utterly, but the metaphysical, will that animated that person carries forward into new individual manifestations, bearing the karmic consequences of previous actions without personal continuity. Rebirth doesn't mean the same personality returning, but the same essential will appearing in fresh individual forms. The cruel tyrant doesn't remember being cruel when reborn as his victim, but the will that expressed itself through tyranny now experiences the suffering it previously inflicted. The compassionate saint doesn't recall her kindness when manifesting as those she helped, but the will that flowed through compassion now receives the benefits it created. This reveals eternal justice as built into reality's structure, rather than imposed from outside. No divine judge distributes rewards and punishments. The universe's moral architecture emerges automatically from will's nature. Since all apparent individuals are modifications of one underlying reality, every action occurs within a unified field where consequences cannot be escaped because there is nowhere external to escape to. Schopenhauer saw that justice operates through metaphysical truth rather than external enforcement. The murderer and victim are ultimately identical will, appearing as separate beings. The thief and the robbed share the same essential nature. Cruelty and compassion both act upon the same fundamental reality that manifests as both perpetrator and recipient. Justice is eternal because it's woven into existence itself, not as punishment, but as the natural consequence of will's self-interaction. Understanding these principles transforms moral action from duty-based compliance to recognition-based, spontaneous compassion. When we truly grasp karma, rebirth, and eternal justice, ethical behavior becomes natural rather than forced. We act compassionately, not because moral law commands it, but because we see clearly that helping others is helping ourselves and harming others is harming ourselves. Moral knowledge emerges from metaphysical understanding rather than ethical reasoning. Schopenhauer recognized that genuine compassion arises when the illusion of separation dissolves, and we perceive the unity underlying apparent diversity. The saint doesn't calculate moral obligations, but responds spontaneously to suffering because she sees it as her own. The sage doesn't follow ethical rules, but acts naturally from the recognition that there is ultimately no other to be cruel to. This vision transcends cultural boundaries and religious differences, pointing toward universal philosophy grounded in direct insight rather than inherited belief. Schopenhauer possessed an unwavering conviction that philosophy, when pursued with sufficient depth and honesty, must eventually arrive at universal truths that transcend the accidents of culture, history, and religious tradition. These truths concern the fundamental nature of existence itself, the basic structure of consciousness, the essential character of reality, and the universal patterns of human experience that any genuinely penetrating investigation must uncover. Truth, for Schopenhauer, is singular and eternal. Cultural differences in philosophical and religious expression represent merely different approaches to the same underlying reality. Different languages attempting to articulate insights that remain constant across time and place. When traditions dig deeply enough beneath surface appearances and cultural prejudices, they inevitably converge on identical recognitions about existence's true nature. This convergence becomes unmistakable when examining how Eastern and Western traditions independently arrive at the same core insights. Hindu Vedanta teaches that ordinary reality is Maya, constructed appearance that conceals the true nature of existence. Buddhist philosophy demonstrates that what we experience as solid, separate selfhood is actually a flowing process of interdependent phenomena. Christian mysticism reveals that attachment to worldly concerns perpetuates spiritual blindness, whilst surrender opens consciousness to deeper truth. Schopenhauer recognized these as different expressions of insights. His own systematic philosophy had reached through purely rational investigation. The phenomenal world of space, time, and causation represents appearance rather than ultimate reality. Individual consciousness constructs a false sense of separateness that generates endless striving and dissatisfaction. Liberation becomes possible only through the complete transformation of consciousness that sees through the illusion of isolated selfhood. All genuine philosophy teaches the same fundamental truth about existence's deceptive nature and consciousness's capacity for transcendence. The specific terminology varies, whether we speak of Brahman and Maya, nirvana and samsara, or will and representation, N reigns, but the essential recognition remains identical. Ordinary awareness systematically deceives us about reality's true character, and this deception constitutes the primary source of unnecessary human suffering. Schopenhauer's synthesis emerged partly from his devastating critique of Western philosophy's optimistic prejudices. European thought had been corrupted by Christian assumptions about divine providence, ensuring ultimate justice and meaning, combined with Enlightenment faith in reason's power to solve all fundamental problems. These assumptions prevented Western philosophers from developing realistic assessments of existence's inherent difficulties. Eastern traditions, unburdened by such optimistic illusions, had maintained clearer vision about life's essential character. They recognized suffering as intrinsic to conscious existence, rather than as an unfortunate accident requiring explanation or justification. They understood that conceptual thinking, however sophisticated, cannot penetrate to reality's deepest levels. They developed practical methods for transforming consciousness rather than merely analyzing its contents. The East had always known what the West was only beginning to discover. It solved that existence itself presents fundamental challenges that cannot be solved through external manipulation, but require internal transformation. This wisdom represented philosophy's maturation beyond provincial European concerns toward genuinely universal human understanding. Schopenhauer envisioned his work as facilitating Western thought's evolution beyond its cultural limitations through serious engagement with traditions that had explored consciousness and suffering more thoroughly. His systematic approach would preserve the rigorous methodology that Western philosophy had developed, whilst incorporating the profound psychological insights that Eastern wisdom had accumulated across millennia. This synthesis pointed toward a truly world philosophy that would integrate humanity's deepest insights whilst maintaining intellectual honesty about existence's genuine nature. Part 8. Psychology and the Unconscious. The pendulum of human existence swings between two poles that Schopenhauer identified with unprecedented clarity: the will that drives us, and the intellect that serves it. For over 2 millennia, Western philosophy had positioned reason as humanity's crown jewel, the faculty that separates us from beasts and enables us to govern our passions through rational reflection. From Plato's vision of reason ruling over appetite to Kant's moral philosophy grounded in rational duty, the tradition assumed that we are fundamentally rational beings who happen to will. Schopenhauer shattered this comfortable illusion with a psychological insight so radical that it anticipated the discoveries of depth psychology by nearly a century. The intellect, Schopenhauer declared, is the will's minister. We are not rational beings who happen to will, but willing beings who happen to be rational. This reversal transforms everything we thought we knew about human nature. Reason does not stand above desire as its judge and controller. Instead, it functions as will's sophisticated tool for survival and satisfaction. The intellect evolved not to seek truth for its own sake, but to help the will navigate the world more effectively, to identify opportunities and threats, to calculate the best means for achieving what we already unconsciously want. Watch this process unfold in your own experience. How often do you find yourself constructing elaborate, rational justifications for decisions you have already made? Is less than #0. 5 is greater than. The will decides, swiftly and unconsciously, what it wants, and then reason scrambles to provide respectable arguments for that choice. You convince yourself that you chose this career, this partner, this lifestyle through careful deliberation. But Schopenhauer reveals that the deliberation typically follows the decision, not the reverse. The intellect serves as will's advocate, not its judge. This insight explains why most human actions flow from unconscious willing rather than conscious reasoning, even when we experience ourselves as acting rationally. Schopenhauer observed that a man can do what he wants, but not want what he wants. Our conscious reasoning can indeed control our actions. We can choose to resist immediate impulses, to act against our inclinations, but it cannot control our fundamental desires, which arise from unconscious willing beyond rational control. You may decide not to pursue someone you find attractive, but you cannot decide not to find them attractive. You may choose to diet, but you cannot choose not to crave food. The deepest currents of wanting flow beneath the surface of conscious thought. This creates a profound problem for self-knowledge. The very faculty we use for self-examination, 2I, the intellect, is systematically biased in favor of the faculty it serves. We cannot simply think our way to truth about ourselves because thinking itself serves willing and therefore distorts what it reveals. The will, as Schopenhauer put it, keeps the intellect in darkness about its own machinations. Whenever self-knowledge would interfere with will's purposes, if recognizing a particular desire would threaten our self-image or social standing, the intellect obligingly looks elsewhere. This systematic self-deception operates through mechanisms that Freud would later systematize: repression, rationalization, projection. But Schopenhauer saw the deeper pattern first. The consciousness naturally avoids recognizing truths that threaten the ego's comfortable narratives about itself. Most of what we call thinking, he realized, is actually willing in disguise. We dress up our desires in the respectable clothing of rational argument, moral principle, or practical necessity. The implications cascade through every aspect of human behavior. Why do we so often repeat patterns we consciously recognize as destructive? Because recognition alone cannot touch the unconscious willing that drives the pattern. Why do intelligent people hold such obviously contradictory beliefs? Because consistency matters less to the will than getting what it wants. Why does therapy take so long and meet such resistance? Because the intellect that seeks insight is the same intellect that has been concealing truth from itself. Schopenhauer's analysis provides the theoretical foundation for understanding phenomena that would not be systematically explored until the advent of psychoanalysis. The intellect serves as will's most faithful servant, systematically crafting justifications for what we've already decided to do. Schopenhauer recognized that we rarely employ reason to determine what we ought to want or pursue, but rather to explain why what we already desire appears reasonable, moral, or necessary. The process operates with such seamless efficiency that we remain convinced of our own rationality whilst engaging in elaborate self-deception. This relationship between will and intellect follows what Schopenhauer described as the intellect is like a lame man who can see, mounted on the shoulders of a blind giant who can walk. Reason possesses the capacity to perceive and articulate, but will provides the driving force and determines the direction. The lame man believes he chooses the path, yet the giant's steps follow his own unconscious impulses. We experience this as rational decision-making, but the conclusion was reached before the reasoning began. The impossibility of pure objectivity emerges from this fundamental structure. The very faculty we employ for thinking serves the interests of willing, which remains inherently biased towards self-preservation and self-satisfaction. This creates systematic distortions in perception, memory, and reasoning that serve will's purposes rather than truth. We notice evidence that supports our desires whilst overlooking contradictory information. Remember events in ways that flatter our self-image and construct arguments that lead inevitably to conclusions we already hold. Schopenhauer observed that objectivity is the rarest of achievements, precisely because it requires intellect to function independently of will's influence. Such independence occurs only in exceptional moments of aesthetic contemplation or philosophical insight, when consciousness temporarily escapes will's tyranny and perceives reality without the distorting lens of personal interest. The sophistication of self-deception mechanisms allows us to maintain comfortable illusions about our motives whilst believing ourselves honest and rational. Schopenhauer anticipated what psychology would later recognize as cognitive biases, defense mechanisms, and motivated reasoning. We interpret evidence in ways that support what we want to believe, rather than what the evidence actually demonstrates. Yet this distortion feels like careful analysis. These systematic errors are not accidental failures of reasoning, but essential features of how consciousness operates when serving willing rather than truth. The merchant who cheats customers convinces himself he provides valuable service. The ambitious politician believes her pursuit of power serves the public good. The jealous lover transforms possessiveness into devotion. Each maintains perfect sincerity in their self-deception because will has already determined what the intellect will discover. Overcoming self-deception requires more than intellectual effort. Schopenhauer understood that unconscious resistance must be worked through rather than simply reasoned away, anticipating depth psychology's recognition that insight alone cannot dissolve deeply embedded patterns. Genuine self-knowledge demands a fundamental shift in the relationship between will and intellect. Those rare moments when intellect achieves temporary independence and can observe what will prefers to keep hidden. Truth remains the enemy of will, because clear-seeing threatens the comfortable illusions that make willing bearable. Achieving clarity about our real motives requires the extraordinary achievement of will-less knowing, when consciousness momentarily escapes its servitude and perceives without the bias of personal interest. Only then do we glimpse the elaborate machinery of rationalization that typically operates beneath awareness, constructing the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why we act. Schopenhauer discovered something unsettling about human nature. We remain essentially the same throughout our lives, not through choice, but through metaphysical necessity. His doctrine of unchangeable character strikes at the heart of our cherished beliefs about self-improvement and moral transformation. The fundamental traits that define your personality, your capacity for generosity or selfishness, your tendency toward cruelty or kindness, your natural optimism or pessimism. Ca. These express your individual manifestation of will and cannot be altered through effort or education. This insight emerged from Schopenhauer's recognition that character operates below the level of conscious decision-making. Whilst we can learn new skills, acquire knowledge, and modify our behavior through discipline, we cannot change the underlying motivational structure that determines how we respond to different situations. A naturally compassionate person may learn to be more discerning in their kindness, but they cannot become fundamentally selfish. A person driven by egoism may develop social graces and learn to mask their self-interest, but they cannot transform themselves into someone who genuinely prioritizes others' welfare above their own. A man never changes, Schopenhauer declared, meaning that the essential pattern of our responses remains constant even as circumstances shift around us. The coward may learn to act bravely in specific situations through training or social pressure, but when faced with genuine danger, their fundamental character will assert itself. The generous soul may become more cautious about giving after being repeatedly deceived, but their basic impulse toward generosity persists as their natural response to others' needs. This doctrine resolves the ancient philosophical tension between determinism and moral responsibility through a radical insight. We are our character, rather than possessing it as something external. We bear responsibility for our actions because they flow authentically from our essential nature, not because we freely chose that nature from some neutral standpoint. Schopenhauer argued that a man is responsible for what he is, not for what he becomes. We cannot be held accountable for failing to transform our fundamental character, but we must answer for the actions that express our actual motivational structure. Every human action, Schopenhauer demonstrated, springs from one of three fundamental motivations. Egoism drives us to pursue our own welfare, often at others' expense. This motivation appears universal and natural. Even apparently selfless acts frequently serve hidden self-interest through reputation, reciprocity, or psychological satisfaction. Malice takes egoism further, finding positive pleasure in others' suffering, rather than merely prioritizing one's own advantage. This darker motivation explains cruelty, schadenfreude, and the human tendency to enjoy others' misfortunes, even when we gain nothing material from their pain. Compassion represents the third and rarest motivation, genuine concern for others' welfare, that leads us to act against our immediate self-interest. Schopenhauer recognized compassion as the only truly moral motivation because it alone transcends the boundaries of individual will. When we act from compassion, we momentarily overcome the metaphysical illusion of separateness that normally divides us from others. We recognize their suffering as real and immediate as our own, responding to their needs as naturally as we respond to our own pain. These three motivations exhaust all possible human behavior, but individuals differ dramatically in their relative strength within each person's character. Some people operate almost entirely from egoism, calculating every interaction in terms of personal advantage. Others possess significant capacity for malice, actively seeking opportunities to harm or humiliate those around them. The rare individuals dominated by compassion find themselves naturally drawn to alleviate suffering wherever they encounter it, often to their own detriment. Understanding character proves essential for both ethical development and practical wisdom. We cannot change our fundamental motivational structure, but we can learn to work skillfully within its constraints rather than fighting uselessly against our essential nature. Part 9. Art, Genius, and Madness. Schopenhauer possessed a profound understanding of genius that cut through centuries of romantic mythology to reveal something far more precise and troubling. For him, genius was not simply exceptional talent or creative ability, but a specific and rare capacity for sustained aesthetic perception, the ability to enter and maintain states of pure, objective knowing that transcend the ordinary boundaries of individual consciousness. Whilst most people experience fleeting moments of aesthetic transcendence when contemplating a sunset or losing themselves in music, the genius possesses what Schopenhauer called an abnormal predominance of sensibility over irritability and reproduction, meaning their perceptual and contemplative capacities so far exceed their practical and Bresson social abilities that they can access these transcendent states at will, sustaining them for extended periods. This capacity for pure perception represents genius's fundamental distinction from mere talent. Talented individuals excel within conventional frameworks, serving practical purposes and achieving recognized success in their domains. The talented musician masters technique. The talented businessman understands markets. The talented politician navigates social dynamics. But talent, however exceptional, remains trapped within the world of willing. It serves purposes, achieves goals, operates according to practical logic. Genius transcends this entirely. As Schopenhauer observed, talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target no one else can see. The genius perceives eternal ideas that lie beyond ordinary experience, accessing truths that cannot be reduced to practical utility or conventional understanding. Yet this extraordinary capacity comes with a terrible price. The same sensitivity that enables genius to perceive what others cannot also makes them acutely vulnerable to existence's intensity. Those most capable of aesthetic transcendence are also most sensitive to life's pain, most aware of suffering's universality, most attuned to the tragic nature of existence itself. The barriers that protect ordinary consciousness from being overwhelmed by reality's full intensity are thinner in geniuses. They feel more deeply, perceive more clearly, and consequently suffer more acutely. Their gift is simultaneously their curse. This vulnerability manifests most clearly in geniuses' inevitable social isolation. Living partially outside the normal world of practical concerns and social conventions, geniuses find genuine communication with ordinary consciousness nearly impossible. Their insights appear incomprehensible to those focused on practical success and social conformity. Their priorities seem strange, impractical, even disturbed. Schopenhauer recognized that genius is condemned to solitude, not through choice, but through the fundamental incompatibility between transcendent insight and conventional understanding. The genius sees targets others cannot even perceive, speaks truths others cannot comprehend, and therefore exists in a state of perpetual alienation from the very society that might benefit from their vision. This isolation reveals genius's dangerous proximity to madness. Both states involve departure from conventional reality. Both challenge ordinary boundaries of perception. Both render their possessors incomprehensible to normal society. The line between transcendent insight and psychological breakdown becomes frighteningly thin when consciousness operates at such extremes of sensitivity and perception. Schopenhauer recognized something that conventional society consistently fails to grasp. Genius and madness share a common departure from ordinary consciousness. Both involve an escape from the comfortable boundaries of conventional perception, reasoning, and social reality. To the ordinary observer, who cannot distinguish between transcendence and breakdown, they appear remarkably similar. The genius lost in contemplation of eternal forms, and the madman trapped in private delusions, both exhibit behavior that seems irrational, incomprehensible, even dangerous to those anchored in everyday concerns. This similarity exists because both conditions involve what Schopenhauer identified as the predominance of perception over abstract reasoning. The genius becomes absorbed in pure perception, seeing beyond the veil of Maya to grasp the eternal ideas that underlie phenomena. The madman also lives primarily through perception, but perception that has become disconnected from reality's coherent structure. Both appear to inhabit worlds different from that which exists for everyone else, leading Schopenhauer to observe that genius and madness have something in common. Both live in a world different from that which exists for everyone else. Yet this surface similarity masks a crucial difference in direction. Genius transcends individuality toward universal truth, whilst madness loses coherence and falls into private fantasy. The genius achieves what Schopenhauer called will-less knowing, a state where personal desires and concerns fade away, allowing consciousness to expand beyond individual limitations toward objective insight. The madman experiences something that might seem similar, a departure from ordinary self-concern, but this departure leads not to expanded awareness, but to fragmented subjectivity. The genius gains objectivity, seeing eternal patterns that illuminate the nature of reality itself. Through aesthetic contemplation or philosophical insight, genius consciousness transcends the narrow focus of personal willing to grasp universal truths. Madness, conversely, loses the ability to distinguish between subjective experience and external reality. Where genius finds method in its departure from convention, madness finds only chaos. Schopenhauer captured this distinction perfectly. Genius is madness with a method. Both involve departure from ordinary consciousness, but genius maintains coherence and achieves genuine insight, whilst madness loses both. This fundamental difference remains invisible to conventional society, which lacks the capacity to distinguish between transcendent insight and psychological breakdown. Society encounters someone who speaks of realities beyond common experience, who behaves according to principles that seem to ignore practical concerns, who appears indifferent to social conventions and material success. Unable to comprehend the difference between someone who has transcended conventional reality through genuine insight and someone who has simply lost contact with reality altogether, society responds with the same mixture of suspicion, dismissal, and persecution. The consequences prove tragic. Genuine insights get dismissed as delusions, whilst actual delusions sometimes receive celebration as inspiration. The visionary, who sees beyond society's limitations, faces the same rejection as the madman who has lost touch with coherent thought. This confusion stems from society's own limitations. Its inability to recognize transcendent truth when it appears, its tendency to mistake the familiar for the real, its fear of anything that challenges established patterns of thought and behavior. The tragedy deepens when we recognize the particular vulnerability of genius. Those most capable of seeing truth prove most susceptible to being overwhelmed by reality's intensity. The same openness to transcendent experience that enables genius also creates psychological fragility. The capacity for extraordinary insight comes with extraordinary sensitivity to suffering, to beauty, to the full weight of existence's contradictions. Schopenhauer understood that genius pays for its gifts with suffering, not merely the external suffering of social rejection, but the internal suffering of consciousness expanded beyond comfortable boundaries. This vulnerability extends beyond psychological fragility to social isolation. Art serves as humanity's great repository, preserving and transmitting the highest insights that consciousness can achieve. Schopenhauer recognized that whilst individual genius may arise only rarely, its discoveries need not perish with the individual. Great artworks function as crystallized moments of transcendent knowledge, capturing in sensuous forms those profound truths about existence that might otherwise remain accessible only to exceptional minds capable of direct philosophical or mystical insight. The masterpieces of painting, poetry, music, and sculpture become vessels carrying forward humanity's deepest understanding of the will's nature and the possibilities for its transcendence. This preservation occurs not through abstract argument, but through direct presentation. When Schopenhauer declared that art is the communication of genius, he identified art's unique capacity to transmit transcendent knowledge without requiring the recipient to possess genius themselves. A great tragedy doesn't merely describe suffering, it presents the eternal patterns of human striving with such clarity that consciousness recognizes universal truths immediately. A sublime landscape painting doesn't argue for nature's significance. It enables direct participation in that will-less contemplation through which the genius originally perceived the ideas. Art makes wisdom tangible, transforming rarefied insights into forms that speak directly to consciousness. The democratizing power of aesthetic education emerges from this communicative function. Through engagement with genuine artworks, ordinary consciousness can temporarily experience the same will less knowing, that genius is accessed naturally. Schopenhauer's revolutionary insight was that art makes everyone momentarily a genius by providing structured access to pure perception and objective knowledge. The viewer standing before a masterpiece, the listener absorbed in a symphony, the reader transported by great poetry. Each participates in transcendent states that would otherwise require exceptional, philosophical, or moral development to achieve independently. This temporary elevation transforms understanding permanently. Having experienced will-less contemplation through art, consciousness retains some capacity to recognize and return to such states. The aesthetic education of humanity thus represents a gradual cultivation of our highest capacities, preparing consciousness for deeper insights into existence's nature and our possibilities for transcendence. Art communicates truths that conceptual argument cannot adequately express. Truths about suffering's universality, transcendence's reality, and the fundamental unity underlying apparent diversity. Great artworks educate consciousness by providing direct experience rather than mere information. They show rather than tell. Enabling recognition rather than requiring belief. Through beauty, consciousness learns to transcend egoistic perspective and perceive universal patterns connecting all existence. This aesthetic cultivation naturally prepares the ground for moral development. Both aesthetic and ethical insight involve transcending narrow self-interest to recognize broader truths. The consciousness educated through beauty becomes more capable of the compassionate recognition that underlies genuine morality. When Schopenhauer observed that beauty is the promise of happiness, he meant not pleasure's satisfaction, but the peace that comes from transcending willing altogether. A peace that points toward both aesthetic transcendence and moral compassion as expressions of the same fundamental recognition. Part 10. Women, Love, and Sexuality. Romantic love stands as perhaps the most compelling illusion in human experience, yet Schopenhauer reveals it as will's most sophisticated deception. What feels like the deepest personal connection between two unique individuals is actually the species thinking through them, orchestrating reproduction, whilst convincing the participants they are acting from their own desires. Love represents will's most cunning trap, a biological imperative, disguised as individual choice, where the most impersonal process masquerades as the most intimate experience. The mechanism of this deception operates through what Schopenhauer recognized as unconscious genetic evaluation. When we believe ourselves drawn to someone's charm, beauty, or personality, we are actually responding to biological signals indicating reproductive compatibility. The unconscious mind assesses health markers, fertility indicators, and genetic complementarity that would produce viable offspring. Every lover becomes, unknowingly, a eugenicist, selecting partners based on criteria that serve species continuation rather than personal happiness. Schopenhauer anticipated modern evolutionary psychology by recognizing that sexual attraction involves sophisticated biological programming. The tall man unconsciously seeks the shorter woman to balance height in offspring. The melancholic temperament gravitates toward the sanguine to create psychological equilibrium in children. Physical features that complement rather than mirror one's own become irresistibly appealing. Yet this entire process remains hidden beneath the romantic narrative of finding one's soulmate or experiencing love at first sight. The overwhelming intensity of romantic passion reflects not the personal significance of the relationship, but the biological importance of reproductive success. Love makes us irrational because irrationality serves reproduction better than calculated decision-making. The lover ignores practical incompatibilities, overlooks character flaws, and sacrifices career prospects or family relationships, all because will requires this temporary madness to ensure genetic continuation. Rational evaluation would often prevent the very unions that serve species' interests. This explains love's characteristic obsessiveness and its tendency to override conscious preferences. The individual believes they are choosing freely, yet finds themselves compelled by forces they cannot understand or control. The businessman abandons his careful planning. The intellectual ignores logical incompatibilities. The cautious person takes extraordinary risks, all because will's reproductive agenda demands precedence over individual rational interests. The tragic revelation emerges in love's aftermath. Once will's reproductive purpose is served, once children are conceived or the biological window closes, the passion that seemed eternal simply evaporates. Couples who felt irresistibly drawn together often discover they have little genuine compatibility beyond their genetic complementarity. The same individuals who couldn't imagine life apart may find themselves indifferent or actively hostile, wondering how they could have been so thoroughly deceived about their feelings. Marriage becomes, in Schopenhauer's memorable phrase, the grave of love, precisely because it exposes romantic passion's true nature. The institution designed to celebrate and preserve love, instead, reveals that love was never about the individuals involved, but about the biological imperative driving them together. What felt like personal destiny was species necessity. What seemed like individual choice was genetic programming. What appeared to be the deepest human connection was actually the most impersonal biological process. This recognition transforms our understanding of romantic relationships entirely. The intensity that lovers interpret as proof of their connection's significance actually demonstrates their manipulation by forces beyond their awareness. The uniqueness they attribute to their bond reflects not personal compatibility, but biological complementarity. The sense of inevitability they experience comes not from destiny, but from genetic determinism operating beneath conscious recognition. Schopenhauer's analysis of relations between men and women cuts through romantic mythology to expose the biological machinery beneath. He argued that what we experience as personal attraction, emotional connection, and relationship conflict actually reflects evolutionary programming that serves reproduction whilst systematically deceiving individuals about their own motives and those of potential partners. The philosopher recognized that men and women operate from fundamentally different reproductive strategies encoded in their psychology. Men, he observed, are driven by programming that maximizes reproductive opportunities through pursuing multiple partners, seeking variety, and responding intensely to physical markers of fertility. This creates a psychology oriented toward conquest, novelty, and the accumulation of sexual experiences. Women, conversely, are shaped by imperatives that secure resources and protection for offspring through selective mating with high-status partners capable of long-term investment. This generates psychology focused on assessment, security, and the cultivation of exclusive pair bonds with resource-rich males. These different biological imperatives create what Schopenhauer saw as inevitable conflicts, disguised as personal incompatibility. When a man pursues multiple women or loses interest after sexual conquest, he appears selfish or commitment-phobic. When a woman demands exclusivity or tests a partner's devotion through emotional drama, she appears manipulative or high maintenance. Yet both are simply following their evolutionary programming. The man's roving eye serves genetic diversity. The woman's mate guarding serves offspring survival. Neither consciously chooses these patterns, yet both suffer their consequences. The impossibility of genuine mutual understanding emerges from these fundamental differences in biological programming. Men and women systematically misinterpret each other's motives because they project their own psychological patterns onto partners operating from entirely different evolutionary strategies. A man assumes a woman's emotional responses reflect his own straightforward desire patterns, failing to recognize her complex assessment of his long-term potential. A woman interprets a man's sexual interest as emotional commitment, missing his biological drive toward variety and conquest. Schopenhauer observed that men and women speak different languages, even when using identical words, because their underlying motivational structures serve different reproductive functions. When a man says, "I love you," he often means, "I desire you sexually." When a woman says, "I love you," she typically means, "I have assessed you as suitable for long-term pair bonding." The same phrase carries entirely different meanings, rooted in different evolutionary strategies. Yet neither party recognizes this fundamental miscommunication. Cultural myths about love, marriage, and gender harmony compound these biological conflicts by creating unrealistic expectations that ignore reproductive realities. Romantic literature portrays passionate love leading naturally to lifelong harmony. Religious teachings sanctify marriage as spiritual union, transcending physical attraction. Social conventions promise that proper courtship and commitment ceremonies will overcome natural conflicts between male and female psychology. These idealizations serve Will's reproductive purposes by encouraging pair formation and offspring production, but they harm individuals by creating impossible standards for relationship satisfaction. The romantic myth suggests that true love conquers all differences, yet biological programming ensures that male desires for variety will conflict with female needs for security. The marriage ideal promises permanent harmony, yet evolutionary psychology guarantees ongoing tension between competing reproductive strategies. Schopenhauer recognized that honest acknowledgement of these biological patterns offers the first step toward freedom from their unconscious control. Knowledge of Will's machinations becomes the beginning of liberation from them. Understanding how sexual attraction and gender differences serve reproductive purposes allows for more conscious choice about relationship structures rather than blind submission to evolutionary programming. This recognition opens possibilities for relationships based on genuine understanding rather than romantic illusion or social convention. The biological machinery of sexual attraction serves nature's reproductive agenda, yet Schopenhauer recognized that human beings possess capacities for connection that transcend these primitive drives. Genuine affection, intellectual companionship, and shared understanding create possibilities for relationships that serve human flourishing rather than species perpetuation. Friendship, he observed, stands as the only relationship not corrupted by the will's reproductive agenda. They a bond formed through mutual appreciation of character, shared interests, and compatible temperaments rather than the deceptions of romantic passion. Such friendships offer what sexual relationships rarely achieve: emotional support without possessiveness, intellectual stimulation without competition, practical cooperation without the hidden agendas that romantic passion inevitably introduces. Two minds can engage freely when not clouded by sexual attraction's biological imperatives. They can offer honest counsel, share genuine interests, and support each other's development without the territorial jealousies and power struggles that characterize romantic partnerships. Schopenhauer valued these relationships precisely because they emerged from conscious choice rather than unconscious biological programming. The passage of time reveals another profound possibility. Aging and the natural decline of sexual passion can paradoxically lead to greater peace and understanding between partners as biological imperatives weaken their grip. Schopenhauer recognized that later stages of life offer potential liberation. When the intensity of sexual will diminishes, individuals can relate more directly to each other's actual personalities and needs, rather than to the projections and fantasies that sexual attraction creates. Old age is the time when love becomes possible, he observed, because the biological deceptions that drive romantic passion lose their power to distort perception and judgment. This transformation allows couples who have endured through decades of biological turbulence to discover who they actually are beneath the roles imposed by reproductive nature. The man no longer driven by conquest, the woman no longer compelled by security-seeking. Both can encounter each other as human beings facing the same existential predicament. Their shared history of navigating will's demands together creates understanding that transcends the original sexual attraction that brought them together. Yet the highest possibility emerges through compassion, AI, the recognition of shared suffering and common humanity that can create bonds serving genuine human welfare rather than species reproduction. Schopenhauer believed that moral development could overcome the egoistic and competitive aspects of sexual relationships by fostering recognition that both men and women are victims of will's reproductive strategies rather than enemies in a battle for resources or control. Compassion dissolves the illusion of sexual opposition by revealing the shared predicament of all conscious beings trapped in will's cycle of desire and satisfaction. This recognition transforms the entire foundation of human relationships. Instead of seeing the opposite sex as either object of desire or competitor for resources, compassion reveals fellow sufferers equally caught in biological programming they did not choose. The woman's behavior during courtship, the man's possessiveness, the conflicts over resources and attention, all appear not as personal failings, but as expressions of deeper forces that manipulate both parties for ends neither truly desires. From this understanding emerges the highest possibility Schopenhauer envisioned. Relationships characterized by mutual recognition of each other's welfare as equally important, transcending both romantic illusion and gender-based competition through genuine moral development. Individuals who had achieved significant insight into will's nature could form relationships based on shared commitment to reducing suffering and supporting each other's philosophical and moral development. Such partnerships require seeing beyond the reproductive agenda to genuine care for the other's liberation from willing itself. These relationships, whilst rare, represent human potential freed from biological tyranny. Part 11. Politics and Society. Schopenhauer possessed no romantic illusions about political authority. The state, in his uncompromising assessment, represents humanity's acknowledgement of its own moral bankruptcy, a necessary evil that exists precisely because human nature makes peaceful coexistence impossible without external coercion. This pessimistic but realistic evaluation cuts through centuries of political theory that sought to justify government through noble purposes or social contracts. For Schopenhauer, the state's true function is far more basic and troubling. It serves as what he called a muzzle for the animal man, preventing the egoistic will from destroying civilized life through mutual predation. Without this external constraint, Schopenhauer argued, individuals driven by blind will would inevitably create what Hobbes described as the war of all against all. But where Hobbes saw this as a theoretical state of nature to be escaped through rational agreement, the will to live, expressing itself through individual egoism, creates an irreconcilable conflict of interests. Each person's striving necessarily conflicts with others' striving, and without coercive power to impose limits, this conflict would make any form of social cooperation impossible. The state doesn't emerge from enlightened self-interest, but from desperate necessity, the recognition that some form of tyranny is preferable to the complete chaos that unchecked egoism would produce. Yet, this necessity creates its own profound corruption. Those who gain political power inevitably use it for personal advantage rather than genuine justice, creating what Schopenhauer saw as the fundamental paradox of all government. The state must be strong enough to restrain evil, but this very strength ensures that it cannot itself be prevented from becoming evil. Power, he observed, attracts precisely those least suited to wield it wisely, those whose own egoistic will drives them to seek dominance over others. Even those who begin with good intentions find themselves corrupted by the very authority they hope to use for noble purposes. Every government, Schopenhauer noted with characteristic bluntness, is essentially a conspiracy against the governed, because those in power will always prioritize their own interests over the welfare of those they claim to serve. This creates the impossible ideal that haunts all political theory. The state must be powerful enough to maintain order and protect individuals from each other's egoism, but this very power makes the state itself a threat to individual welfare and freedom. Schopenhauer recognized this as an unsolvable dilemma rather than a problem awaiting the right constitutional arrangement or democratic reform. Weak government allows private tyranny and chaos, while strong government enables public tyranny and oppression. We need protection from our protectors, but we cannot protect ourselves from them without becoming protectors ourselves, and thus falling into the same corruption. All political systems, therefore, represent different ways of managing this fundamental contradiction rather than resolving it. Democracy may distribute power more widely, but it cannot eliminate the essential problem that power corrupts, and that those who seek it are least qualified to possess it. Constitutional limits may restrain government temporarily, but they cannot prevent the gradual erosion of these limits by those who find them inconvenient. Revolution may replace one set of rulers with another, but it cannot change the nature of rule itself. Given this analysis, what stance should the wise person adopt toward political engagement? Schopenhauer advocated a position of strategic withdrawal, ABA, fulfilling minimal necessary civic obligations, whilst maintaining inner independence and avoiding the corruption that comes from seeking or wielding political power. The philosopher's relationship to the state, he suggested, should be like a passenger's relationship to a ship, grateful for safe passage but not identifying with the vessel. One participates enough in political life to avoid persecution, whilst refusing to invest one's identity or hopes in political solutions to existential problems. This withdrawal isn't cynical indifference, but philosophical wisdom. Schopenhauer delivered a devastating blow to Enlightenment optimism and Hegelian faith in historical development. Against the prevailing belief that humanity progresses toward greater freedom and rationality, he argued that such theories fundamentally misunderstand human nature. The philosophers of progress, he contended, mistake the changing costumes of history for genuine transformation, whilst ignoring the unchangeable character of will that drives all human behavior. History, in Schopenhauer's memorable phrase, is merely the same story told over and over with different costumes. the identical patterns of desire, conflict, and suffering, repeating endlessly across cultures and centuries. This constancy of human nature forms the bedrock of Schopenhauer's social pessimism. The ancient Greek and the modern European, he observed, are driven by identical motivations: egoism seeking its own advantage, malice delighting in others' misfortune, and occasionally, though rarely, genuine compassion recognizing shared suffering. Technological advancement and institutional reform alter the surface of existence, but leave its essential character utterly untouched. The businessman scheming for profit operates from the same fundamental drives as the medieval baron seizing territory. The politician promising reform channels the same will to power as the ancient tyrant. External circumstances shift dramatically, yet the underlying motivations remain constant across all times and places. This insight reveals why revolutions and reforms invariably disappoint their most ardent supporters. They address symptoms rather than causes, rearranging external conditions whilst leaving the fundamental source of human problems, Sexuality, willing consciousness itself, completely unchanged. Political movements promise liberation from problems that emerge from the very structure of conscious existence. Each revolution becomes merely a changing of the guard, not a liberation of the prisoners. New rulers replace old ones, but the basic relationship between power and subjection continues unaltered. The oppressed become oppressors. The reformers become the establishment they once opposed, and the cycle perpetuates itself with predictable inevitability. The illusion of progress emerges from mistaking these surface changes for genuine improvement in the human condition. Whilst particular forms of suffering may diminish, the fundamental problems of existence, suffering itself, death, the futility of desire, remain unchanged, regardless of social organization. Schopenhauer recognized belief in social progress as another manifestation of Maya, the veil of illusion that distracts from reality's true nature. This comforting delusion prevents individuals from undertaking the only genuine progress possible: individual enlightenment through liberation from willing itself. Social reform, though sometimes reducing specific forms of suffering, cannot address the existential problems inherent in consciousness. The pendulum of history swings between extremes, but never escapes its fundamental arc of human limitation and inevitable disappointment. Schopenhauer advocated what we might call strategic citizenship, a careful balance between fulfilling minimal civic duties whilst preserving the intellectual independence essential for philosophical life. He understood that complete withdrawal from social obligations invites persecution and disrupts the peace necessary for contemplation, yet deep involvement in political movements corrupts the very clarity such engagement claims to serve. The wise person, he argued, remains a good citizen but never a zealous one, meeting basic responsibilities without investing identity or hope in political solutions to what are fundamentally existential problems. This approach emerges from Schopenhauer's recognition that political enthusiasm springs from the same will that drives all forms of striving and suffering. To become deeply invested in social reform or collective movements is to remain trapped within the very system of willing that philosophy seeks to understand and transcend. The philosopher who campaigns for justice with passionate intensity has merely redirected personal ambition towards seemingly noble ends, but the underlying structure of desire, frustration, and renewed striving remains unchanged. Strategic citizenship acknowledges political reality, whilst refusing to mistake it for ultimate reality. The withdrawal Schopenhauer recommended serves philosophical development rather than personal resentment. He distinguished sharply between the healthy solitude that enables contemplation and the bitter isolation that springs from disappointed ambition or wounded pride. The philosopher retreats not because humanity has failed to appreciate their genius, but because sustained reflection on existence's fundamental nature requires freedom from the constant demands and emotional turbulence of intensive social involvement. Solitude becomes the natural element for philosophical work, not a refuge from social failure. This distinction matters because misanthropy poisons philosophical insight as surely as social ambition corrupts it. The philosopher who withdraws in anger or disgust carries the very resentment that clouds clear seeing. Schopenhauer insisted that genuine philosophical solitude emerges from understanding rather than disappointment. C. The recognition that truth is indeed a solitary achievement, that the crowd is the enemy of contemplation, not because crowds are evil, but because collective consciousness operates according to principles that make sustained philosophical reflection impossible. Such withdrawal never means abandoning compassion toward individual human beings. Schopenhauer envisioned a position that avoids both selfish isolation and naive social activism. Social activism, maintaining enough distance from collective enterprises to preserve philosophical clarity whilst remaining compassionately engaged with particular persons who suffer. The philosopher serves humanity best by understanding it clearly rather than by attempting to reform it through political action. This service operates through example and teaching rather than through campaigns and movements. The highest individuals must remain somewhat apart from collective enterprises precisely because their greatest contribution lies in achieving the clarity that mass involvement makes impossible. They honor basic duties of justice, whilst refusing to invest their deepest energies in projects that, however well-intentioned, cannot address the fundamental structure of existence that creates suffering in the first place. This creates the space necessary for the kind of understanding that genuinely benefits others, not through changing external circumstances, but through demonstrating the possibility of inner freedom from the will's tyranny. Part 12. Practical Wisdom. Schopenhauer discovered the essential paradox of human intimacy in a simple parable about hedgehogs. Picture these creatures in the bitter cold of winter, desperately seeking warmth. They huddle together for survival, but their sharp spines inevitably wound each other. They pull apart to escape the pain, only to face the killing cold again. They edge closer once more, seeking that life-giving warmth, and again the spines pierce their flesh. This endless dance of approach and retreat, Schopenhauer argued, captures the fundamental dilemma of human relationships with startling precision. The hedgehog dilemma is the human condition. We cannot live happily in isolation, yet we cannot live peacefully in close proximity. Our need for emotional warmth drives us toward others, but our individual egoisms, incompatible desires, and conflicting needs ensure that intimacy brings suffering. The closer we draw to another person, the more we discover their irritating habits, their selfish demands, their fundamental otherness that grates against our own nature. Yet distance brings its own agony, the loneliness that gnaws at human consciousness, the absence of understanding and support that leaves us vulnerable to despair. Schopenhauer's genius lay not merely in diagnosing this dilemma, but in prescribing practical wisdom for managing it. The art of life, he recognized, consists in finding the right distance from others, close enough to receive genuine warmth and provide mutual support, yet far enough to avoid the psychological wounds that excessive intimacy inevitably inflicts. This optimal social distance requires constant calibration, shifting with circumstances and relationships, demanding a delicate sensitivity to both our own needs and the limits of what others can provide. Most people fail at this calibration because they expect either too much or too little from human connection. Those who demand complete understanding, perfect compatibility, or selfless devotion set themselves up for bitter disappointment. They push too close, like hedgehogs driven by desperate cold, and emerge bloodied by the inevitable conflicts that arise when individual wills collide. Others, wounded by past hurts, retreat into protective isolation, denying themselves the genuine warmth that careful relationships can provide. Both extremes miss the middle path that Schopenhauer advocated. Accepting the inherent limitations of human relationships while still appreciating the real comfort they offer within those boundaries. This wisdom finds its practical expression in the cultivation of politeness and courtesy. Schopenhauer saw good manners not as superficial social convention, but as sophisticated technology for managing the friction between incompatible personalities. Politeness serves as oil in the machinery of human interaction, reducing the heat generated when different characters must work in proximity. It acknowledges that we will inevitably annoy and disappoint each other, but provides ritualized ways of minimizing harm and maintaining peaceful coexistence. Courtesy becomes particularly crucial because it operates independently of genuine affection or understanding. We need not love our neighbors to treat them with respect, need not share their values to avoid unnecessary offense, need not understand their motivations to refrain from deliberate cruelty. Politeness creates a buffer zone that allows people with fundamentally different natures to share social space without constant conflict. It represents practical wisdom about human limitations rather than idealistic hope for perfect harmony. The deeper insight emerges when we recognize that friendship itself becomes possible only between those who understand its limits. True companionship develops not through the fantasy of complete merger or perfect understanding, but through mutual recognition of each other's boundaries and needs. The best relationships maintain that optimal distance, intimate enough for genuine care and support, distant enough to preserve individual autonomy, and avoid the resentment that comes from excessive demands. Schopenhauer's hedgehog parable thus reveals relationship wisdom that transcends mere social strategy. It illuminates the fundamental structure of human existence. In Tao, our simultaneous need for connection and our inevitable isolation, our capacity for both love and harm, our requirement for both intimacy and independence. Schopenhauer possessed a remarkable gift for distilling the most complex philosophical insights into sharp, memorable observations that cut straight to the heart of human experience. His Parerga and Paralipomena contains some of the most penetrating aphorisms ever written, each one a crystallized truth that emerges directly from his systematic understanding of will, representation, and the fundamental structure of existence. These aren't mere clever sayings, but practical wisdom forged in the crucible of philosophical understanding. Concentrated insights that can guide actual living. Consider his famous observation: "A man can do what he wants, but not want what he wants." This seemingly simple statement encapsulates his entire understanding of human freedom and limitation. We experience ourselves as free agents making choices, yet the deepest currents of our wanting, our fundamental desires, attractions, and aversions, arise from depths beyond our conscious control. The will that drives us operates beneath the surface of rational deliberation. This insight transforms how we approach personal responsibility and self-understanding. We can choose our actions, but we cannot choose the wanting that motivates those actions. Equally profound is his recognition that all satisfaction is negative. Pleasure, he understood, is never a positive state, but merely the temporary absence of pain or want. We don't experience satisfaction as something present. We experience it as the relief from dissatisfaction. This explains why happiness feels so fleeting, while suffering feels so substantial. The insight reshapes our relationship to desire itself. Rather than pursuing positive states that don't truly exist, we can focus on minimizing the genuine negatives: pain, anxiety, unfulfilled longing. His most famous aphorism captures the essential rhythm of human existence. The two enemies of human happiness are pain and boredom. Life swings like a pendulum between the pole of want, with its attendant suffering, and the pole of satisfaction, with its inevitable tedium. When we lack what we desire, we suffer from that lack. When we possess what we wanted, we discover that possession brings not lasting joy, but restlessness, emptiness, the need for new objects of desire. This pendulum motion reveals why happiness remains so elusive. We're always moving between two forms of dissatisfaction. Understanding this rhythm allows for practical wisdom. Instead of expecting to escape the pendulum entirely, we can learn to recognize where we are in its swing and respond accordingly. During periods of want and striving, we can remember that this too shall pass. During periods of satisfaction and potential boredom, we can appreciate the temporary peace without expecting it to last forever. The aphorism becomes a tool for emotional regulation and realistic expectation. Schopenhauer's insights into social existence prove equally valuable. We forfeit 3/4 of ourselves in order to be like other people. Captures the enormous cost of social conformity. Most human misery stems not from genuine necessity, but from the exhausting attempt to meet others' expectations, to present acceptable facades, to suppress authentic responses in favor of socially approved ones. This observation doesn't advocate antisocial behavior, but rather conscious choice about when conformity serves genuine purposes and when it merely imprisons us in others' opinions. His practical maxims for daily living emerge directly from philosophical understanding. It is difficult to keep quiet if you have nothing to do, but much more difficult if you have a great deal to do. Reveals the paradoxical relationship between activity and inner peace. Idleness breeds restlessness, but excessive busyness breeds anxiety. The wisdom lies in finding the middle path. Enough engagement to prevent boredom. Enough stillness to prevent overwhelm. The greatest wisdom is to make the enjoyment of the present the supreme object of life. Might seem to contradict his pessimism, but it represents practical accommodation to existence as we find it. Since future satisfaction proves illusory and past satisfaction cannot be recovered, whatever genuine peace exists must be found in present moments of relative contentment. Life swings like a pendulum between the poles of want and boredom, Schopenhauer observed. And wisdom begins when we stop trying to escape this fundamental rhythm. Philosophical resignation emerges not as defeat, but as mature acceptance, the recognition that existence operates within certain unalterable constraints and that our suffering comes not from these constraints themselves, but from our futile resistance to them. This resignation differs fundamentally from both naive optimism and bitter pessimism. The optimist expects life to deliver perpetual satisfaction, constantly disappointed when reality fails to match inflated expectations. The pessimist resents existence for not providing what it was never designed to give, nursing grievances against the very nature of being. Wisdom consists in wanting what life offers rather than demanding what it cannot provide, accepting the pendulum's swing whilst learning to find stability in our response to its motion. The practical cultivation of this wisdom begins with deliberately seeking satisfaction in simple pleasures whilst resisting the endless escalation of desires. Schopenhauer recognized that we suffer not from lacking what we need, but from constantly comparing our situation to others' apparent success. The neighbor's prosperity, the colleague's recognition, the friend's romance. These become sources of torment only when we measure our welfare against external standards, rather than appreciating what we actually possess. True contentment emerges from cultivating appreciation for basic satisfactions. Health when we have it, safety in our daily routines, the comfort of simple shelter, the beauty available in natural surroundings, the pleasure of intellectual stimulation. These require no competition, no comparison, no achievement beyond recognition. The secret of happiness is not getting what you want, but wanting what you get. Finding richness in the ordinary, rather than constantly seeking extraordinary intensity. Yet resignation does not mean withdrawal. The mature wisdom that emerges from Schopenhauer's philosophy requires a delicate balance between engagement and detachment. A.S. Participating fully in life without being enslaved by its outcomes. We maintain compassion for others, whilst protecting ourselves from unnecessary suffering. We pursue worthwhile goals, whilst accepting that all achievements are ultimately temporary. This engaged resignation allows us to be fully present, but not fully attached. This balance extends to our relationships with others. We can love without possessiveness, help without expectation, achieve without pride. The wise person contributes to the world's work whilst recognizing that all human endeavors are temporary expressions of the underlying will. We perform our roles skillfully, whilst remembering that the drama itself is ultimately illusory. The ultimate practical wisdom that emerges from Schopenhauer's complete philosophical system offers a realistic path between naive hope and despairing nihilism. Life is a task to be completed rather than a problem to be solved, and wisdom involves accepting this task whilst performing it as skillfully and compassionately as possible. We learn to live skillfully within the constraints of existence as willing consciousness, whilst remaining open to those rare moments when aesthetic experience, moral insight, or contemplative practice offers glimpses of transcendence. The pendulum continues its swing, but we need no longer be at its mercy. Through philosophical resignation, combined with practical wisdom, we discover how to find stability not in stopping the motion, but in learning to dance with it. Part 13. Conclusion. Schopenhauer's philosophy achieves something extraordinarily rare in intellectual history: the systematic unity of a single, coherent vision that encompasses the entire range of human experience. His insight that philosophy must be a single thought finds its fulfillment in a system where each component connects logically with all others. The world as representation provides the epistemological foundation that makes possible his metaphysics of will, which in turn explains both his aesthetics of pure perception and his ethics of compassion. His practical wisdom emerges naturally from understanding these fundamental insights about existence's nature. Knowledge reveals the phenomenal world's constructed character, leading to recognition of will as the thing in itself, which illuminates why aesthetic experience temporarily liberates us from willing's tyranny, and why genuine morality springs from recognizing our essential unity beneath apparent separation. This systematic coherence serves a profound purpose, demonstrating that existence is fundamentally characterized by suffering due to willing consciousness's very nature, while simultaneously revealing genuine possibilities for transcendence. Schopenhauer's unflinching analysis of life's difficulties paradoxically enables realistic hope about peace and wisdom's possibilities. His pessimism about inherent suffering serves liberation rather than despair, embodying his crucial insight that only by fully understanding the problem can we discover the solution. Through aesthetic experience, moral development, and in exceptional cases complete liberation from desire's cycle, consciousness can transcend its ordinary bondage to will's blind striving. The intellectual legacy proves equally systematic. His concept of will anticipated Nietzsche's will to power. His analysis of unconscious motivation laid groundwork for Freud's revolutionary discoveries. His aesthetic philosophy influenced Wagner and subsequent artistic movements, whilst his confrontation with existence's fundamental difficulties helped establish existentialism's focus on anxiety, authenticity, and meaning search in an apparently meaningless universe. Most remarkably, his synthesis of Eastern and Western wisdom speaks directly to contemporary concerns about human psychology, desire's nature, and peace's possibilities in our competitive, individualistic world. His insights about the self's constructed nature, unconscious motivation's role, suffering's relationship to desire, and transcendent consciousness's possibilities address modern questions about mental health, authentic living, and spiritual development with startling prescience. Schopenhauer's lasting contribution transcends academic philosophy. He provided the most systematic and unflinching examination of life's difficulties, whilst demonstrating that knowledge of truth, however initially painful, opens the only genuine paths to whatever happiness, peace, and wisdom remain possible for conscious beings in a world governed by blind will. His philosophy offers no false comfort, but something more valuable: clear sight into reality's nature and practical guidance for navigating existence with dignity, compassion, and occasional moments of genuine transcendence.